I came home from work and found my wife standing frozen at the gate with a small grocery bag. Our own son told my wife this house belongs to him now and that she needs to leave immediately. I picked up her bag, walked her inside, and then I decided to dismantle his entire existence. My name is Gerald. I am 70 years old, and what I am about to tell you will completely change how you view your own family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who severely underestimated your worth. I pulled my rusted pickup truck into the driveway after a long, exhausting shift managing a local hardware supply store. The sight that greeted me made my blood run entirely cold. Brenda, my beautiful wife of 40 years, stood shivering on the curb. The harsh evening wind whipped around her frail shoulders. She clutched a single paper grocery bag against her chest, looking completely disoriented and terrified. I killed the engine and stepped out of the truck quickly. My gaze shifted from my weeping wife to the front porch of our home. Kendall, my 35-year-old son, stood blocking the front door like a bouncer. Beside him stood his wife, Madison. Madison clutched a thick stack of papers with a glossy blue notary seal visible on the top page. She waved the documents in the freezing air like a victorious trophy. She loudly declared that the property now belonged exclusively to Kendall's limited liability company. She announced they were gutting the interior starting tomorrow morning for a total modern renovation. Brenda looked at me, her eyes wide with terror, whispering that they had locked her out when she simply went to get the evening mail. I walked toward them, my heavy work boots crunching aggressively against the gravel path. Kendall stepped forward to the edge of the porch, adjusting the knot of his expensive designer silk tie. He did not look like a son addressing his father. He looked like a hostile corporate liquidator preparing to strip a bankrupt asset. He looked me dead in the eye and delivered his terms with chilling, calculated precision. He told me they were moving Brenda to a state-run care facility by the end of the week. He claimed her ongoing medical needs and heart condition were a massive financial drain on his future inheritance and overall profit margins. He stated that the house was simply too valuable an asset to waste on two aging people who could barely maintain the front lawn anymore. Madison crossed her arms, her diamond rings catching the harsh porch light. She chimed in, demanding I hand over my set of the house keys immediately. She insisted I pack a single suitcase for myself and find a cheap motel for the night because the demolition crew was arriving at dawn to tear down the walls. She even suggested a rundown, insect-infested lodge on the highway. Kendall added that I should consider this aggressive eviction a massive favor. He argued that the neighborhood property taxes were rising rapidly, and a man my age had no business pretending to be the master of a 4-bedroom estate in a gentrifying district. He ordered me to surrender the keys, sign the remaining transfer logs, and walk away quietly to spare everyone the sheer embarrassment of a public eviction scene. The sheer audacity of his demands hung heavily in the freezing evening air. My own son, the boy I had raised, clothed, and educated through sheer grueling labor, was standing on the steps of the home I built with my bare hands, orchestrating a ruthless eviction against his own mother. He spoke of Brenda's serious heart condition, not with a loyal son's concern, but with a predatory accountant's absolute disdain for a bad investment portfolio. He assumed my silence was terrified, pathetic submission. He assumed the dirty, oil-stained coveralls I wore meant I lacked the intelligence to fight back against his corporate maneuvers. He held out his manicured hand, waiting for the brass keys to drop into his soft palm. I kept my hands securely at my sides and finally looked closely at the paperwork Madison waved in her tight grip. I immediately recognized the formatting of the document. It was a notarized quitclaim deed. A year ago, Kendall, who operates as a highly paid certified public accountant, brought a thick stack of papers to my kitchen table. He asked me to sign a complex tax relief form to help me save money on upcoming municipal property assessments. I trusted my son. I trusted his advanced degree. Now, seeing the blue seal gleaming in the light, the brutal truth slammed into me. I realized my signature had been maliciously harvested and attached to a completely fraudulent property transfer deed. Kendall had legally stolen my home right under my nose, using my own trust against me. But my son made one fatal miscalculation in his grand scheme. He completely forgot who he was dealing with. Before taking the hardware store job to stay physically active in my retirement, I spent 40 grueling years working as a senior director in municipal city planning. I handled complicated zoning laws, massive commercial real estate transfers, and municipal property deeds every single day of my professional career. I recognized the blatant forgery and the critical structural flaws in his document instantly. Kendall truly thought he was tricking an uneducated, exhausted old man. I did not yell. I did not waste my breath demanding basic respect or begging for access to my own legally purchased home. I simply turned around and walked calmly back to the curb. I wrapped my arm tightly around Brenda's trembling shoulders, picked up her fallen grocery bag from the concrete, and guided her steadily toward the front steps. Kendall blocked the threshold, puffing out his chest to physically intimidate me. He barked that I was aggressively trespassing on his private corporate property and ordered me to halt immediately. I did not stop walking. As soon as I reached the top step, I dropped the grocery bag. I grabbed Kendall by the collar of his tailored shirt with my heavy, calloused hands. The decades of lifting lumber and mixing raw concrete gave me raw, unyielding physical strength he could never possibly comprehend. I lifted him entirely off his feet, twisting my grip, and physically hurled my son backward off the porch. He crashed hard into the thorny ornamental bushes below, shouting in sudden shock and intense physical pain. Madison shrieked, dropping her forged legal documents onto the wooden deck and scrambling backward against the brick wall in absolute terror. I shoved past her without a single glance, pulled Brenda inside the warm hallway, and slammed the heavy oak door shut behind us. I threw the solid steel deadbolt, locking the criminals outside in the cold. From the front yard, I heard Kendall desperately scrambling to his feet in the dirt. He pulled out his expensive smartphone and frantically dialed 911, screaming into the receiver that he was the bleeding victim of a violent home invasion perpetrated by his own deranged parents. The war had officially begun. The sharp wail of police sirens sliced through the freezing night air less than 10 minutes later. Red and blue lights flashed violently against the front windows of my home, casting erratic shadows across the hallway walls. I stood perfectly still, placing a reassuring hand on Brenda's shoulder as heavy, authoritative fists began pounding against the solid oak of our front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open smoothly, maintaining a calm, unyielding posture. 2 armed police officers stood on my porch, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. Behind them, standing safely in the yard, Kendall pointed an accusing finger directly at my chest. He marched up the steps aggressively, shoving the thick stack of notarized papers directly into the chest of the lead officer. Kendall's voice was shrill, laced with a theatrical panic that disgusted me. He loudly claimed that I had brutally assaulted him and forcefully seized a property that legally belonged to his corporate entity. He demanded that the officers arrest both me and his mother for severe criminal trespassing and aggravated assault. He insisted we were dangerous squatters who refused to vacate the premises after a lawful documented transfer of ownership. The lead officer held up a hand instructing Kendall to step back and lower his voice before turning his stern gaze toward me. He asked for my identification and an immediate explanation for the physical altercation that had clearly left dirt and scratches on Kendall's expensive suit. I did not raise my voice or attempt to argue with the frantic accusations my son was hurling from the lawn. I simply looked the officer in the eye and stated that I was the sole owner of the property, defending my home against a hostile intrusion. The second officer took the glossy documents from his partner, shining a bright tactical flashlight over the pages. They scrutinized the signatures, the raised blue notary seals, and the official-looking letterhead Kendall had meticulously fabricated. The paperwork appeared entirely legitimate to a patrol officer conducting a preliminary field assessment. The lead officer sighed, adjusting his stance with a look of bureaucratic resignation. He looked at Brenda, who was trembling quietly beside me, and then back at me. He stated that the deed appeared valid on its face, and because Kendall was claiming imminent construction and a hostile threat, they had no choice but to enforce the immediate eviction. He instructed Brenda and me to gather our essential medications, pack a single bag of clothing, and vacate the premises immediately to avoid being placed in handcuffs. Hearing this, Madison strutted up the front steps, entirely abandoning her previous act of terror. A vicious, triumphant smirk stretched across her face as she pulled her smartphone from her designer purse. She held the camera up, recording Brenda's tears and my stoic silence, narrating the scene for her social media followers. She loudly mocked us, stating that toxic, stubborn tenants were finally being removed so her luxury brand could expand into its rightful headquarters. Her camera lens hovered mere inches from my face, documenting what she believed was my ultimate defeat. Brenda grabbed my arm, her grip tight with panic, whispering that we had nowhere to go in the middle of the night. I squeezed her hand firmly, offering a silent promise of absolute security. I turned to the lead officer and requested exactly 2 minutes to retrieve a vital medical document from my office safe before we abandoned the property. The officer hesitated, then nodded, warning me that he would stand right in the doorway to monitor my every move. I walked down the hall with deliberate, measured steps, ignoring Madison's taunting commentary behind me. I entered my study, knelt on the hardwood floor, and pulled back the Persian rug. I spun the dial on my heavy floor safe, the mechanical clicks echoing like a ticking clock in the tense atmosphere. I pulled out a heavy fireproof manila folder that had rested undisturbed for more than 2 decades. Kendall and Madison had spent months scheming based on public county tax records, but those records only showed a fraction of the truth. During my 40 years managing the city planning department, I learned exactly how municipal zoning and property concealment functioned. In the early 90s, anticipating the eventual gentrification of this exact neighborhood, I did not just buy the residential lot containing our house. I quietly purchased the surrounding 5 acres of undeveloped land through an anonymous blind trust. I legally merged the lots into a single unified commercial parcel under federal protections, keeping my name entirely off the localized public registry. Kendall's fraudulent tax relief form was designed to steal a standard residential title. He never knew the actual estate structure because I kept my wealth entirely hidden to ensure he learned the value of hard work rather than waiting for an inheritance. He thought he outsmarted an ignorant old man who simply hammered nails and mowed lawns. He had no idea he had just submitted forged documents against a heavily fortified commercial land patent that completely overrode local municipal deeds. I walked back to the front porch and handed the heavy folder directly to the lead officer. I instructed him to look at the federal land patent and the original trust deed establishing the commercial parcel. I calmly pointed a finger at Kendall's glossy forged quitclaim deed. I explained to the officers that the specific geographic coordinates Kendall had cunningly transferred to his limited liability company did not cover the main residential house. The coordinates he stole only applied to the detached rusted garden shed sitting at the far edge of the backyard. The officers compared the land patent overlay with Kendall's paperwork. The lead officer's expression shifted from bureaucratic boredom to sharp realization. He handed Kendall's paperwork back to him with a look of pure disgust. The officer loudly declared that the quitclaim deed did not grant Kendall access to the primary residence, rendering his eviction attempt completely illegal. He informed my son that this was a complex civil matter regarding a garden shed and ordered Kendall and Madison to step off my property immediately or face arrest for filing a false police report and trespassing. Kendall stared at the federal patent in absolute horror, realizing his entire hostile takeover had failed spectacularly. His face turned a sickly shade of gray as the officers physically stepped forward, forcing him down the steps and onto the public sidewalk. Madison stopped recording her smug grin, vanishing into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She realized her luxury headquarters was nothing but a wooden shack filled with rusted lawnmowers. She pointed a manicured finger at me from the street, her voice shrill and echoing through the quiet neighborhood. She screamed that she had my banking information and promised to freeze every single dime in my accounts before the sun came up. I simply closed the heavy oak door and locked it tight. The harsh fluorescent lights of the pharmacy buzzed overhead, casting a sterile, unforgiving glare across the linoleum floor. I stood in front of the elevated plexiglass partition, watching the pharmacist scan the barcode on Brenda's prescription bag. These pills were not optional daily vitamins. They were specialized high-grade beta blockers absolutely required to keep her fragile heart beating in a steady, reliable rhythm. I pulled my primary debit card from my leather wallet and inserted it firmly into the chip reader. The machine processed the data for 3 long seconds before emitting a sharp, obnoxious beep. The digital screen flashed a bright red error message stating the transaction was declined. The pharmacist, a young woman who knew me by my first name, offered a highly sympathetic, apologetic smile and softly suggested I try running the transaction again. I wiped the gold chip on my denim jacket, inserted the plastic square a second time, and waited. The exact same sharp beep echoed through the quiet medicinal aisle. The transaction was declined again. A cold, heavy knot formed instantly in my stomach. I carried an immaculate, flawless credit score and never allowed a checking account balance to drop below 5 figures in my entire life. I reached back into my wallet and withdrew my secondary credit card, a premium line of credit directly linked to my municipal pension fund. I swiped the magnetic strip. The terminal immediately rejected the transaction and displayed a harsh prompt instructing the cashier to physically seize the card. The young woman looked at the screen, her eyes widening in genuine confusion, and quietly informed me that a hard federal hold had been placed on all my banking profiles. Brenda needed her medication by noon. Without it, her blood pressure would spike to dangerous, potentially lethal levels. Madison's furious scream from the street the night before echoed in my mind. She had promised to freeze every single dime I owned before the sun came up. She had actually done it. I stepped out of the automatic sliding doors and walked directly into the freezing morning air. I pulled my phone from my pocket and immediately dialed the primary customer service line for my financial institution. I bypassed the automated menus demanding to speak directly to a senior fraud resolution manager. After a grueling, infuriating 10-minute hold, a stern-voiced representative finally answered the call. I provided my social security number, my verified security pins, and my deeply guarded account passwords. The representative firmly informed me that she could not authorize any outgoing transfers, nor could she manually release the hold on the funds. I demanded a strict legal explanation for the sudden catastrophic freeze on my life savings. She hesitated, citing strict corporate privacy policies, before reluctantly reading the official notes attached to my profile. Early that morning, an emergency legal report had been filed with the state's Adult Protective Services and forwarded directly to the bank's internal fraud division. The claim explicitly alleged severe elder financial abuse. The filer stated on the official record that I was currently suffering from rapid, violent cognitive decline and actively squandering my municipal pension on erratic, dangerous purchases. The report officially requested a total lockdown of my assets to prevent me from bankrupting myself and my highly dependent wife. I demanded the name of the individual who filed the emergency injunction. The representative stated that the report was filed by my designated secondary account holder, my son Kendall, acting under the urgent legal advice of his business owner, wife Madison. They had weaponized the very banking protocols designed to protect vulnerable seniors, twisting the law to entirely cut off my access to my own capital. The bank was legally obligated to freeze the accounts completely pending a thorough state-mandated psychological investigation. It was a bureaucratic nightmare that could easily drag on for 6 agonizing months. Kendall and Madison were not just trying to steal the commercial property out from under my feet. They were executing a calculated, malicious financial siege. By cutting off the money flow, they intended to strip my ability to hire a competent defense attorney, pay for basic household utilities, or purchase the life-saving medication Brenda desperately required. They wanted to force me into a position of absolute humiliating submission. I stood in the parking lot, staring at the cracked asphalt, gripping the phone until my knuckles turned completely white. For decades, I intentionally drove a rusted pickup truck and wore faded denim work shirts. I packed my lunches in brown paper bags and repaired my own household plumbing. I did these things purposefully to instill a sense of grueling work ethic and profound humility in my only son. I wanted Kendall to clearly understand the sheer value of a hard-earned dollar. Instead of absorbing the critical life lesson, Kendall severely mistook my disciplined frugality for pathetic, inescapable struggle. He looked at my worn boots and assumed I was a poor, uneducated laborer barely scraping by on a modest city pension. He entirely and fundamentally underestimated me. He had absolutely no idea that my actual wealth, the massive fortune I built through relentless commercial zoning investments during the city's expansion boom, was intentionally shielded. Furthermore, he possessed zero knowledge of the tangible emergency reserves I had diligently compiled specifically to guard against unforeseen bureaucratic disasters. I never trusted the modern digital banking system with my entire livelihood. I knew that electronic wealth could vanish with a single malicious keystroke. I walked back inside the pharmacy, my posture straight and my facial expression entirely composed. I bypassed the credit card terminal completely. I reached into the hidden inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a thick, leather-bound money clip. I peeled off 3 crisp, uncirculated $100 bills and placed them squarely on the glass counter. The pharmacist processed the transaction, handed me the paper bag containing Brenda's vital heart medication, and returned my change. I thanked her politely, grabbed the bag, and exited the store. My mind was operating with crystalline surgical precision. The initial shock of the familial betrayal had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. Kendall and Madison were actively attempting to starve me out. They wanted to watch me physically suffer, hoping my intense desperation would eventually force me to surrender the unified commercial deed to the estate. They were playing a deadly, unforgivable game with my wife's health and my family's fundamental survival. They wanted an absolute war. I climbed into the cab of my rusted truck, placed the medication securely on the passenger seat, and turned the ignition key. The old engine roared to life with a heavy mechanical growl. I did not drive back toward my residential neighborhood. I turned the steering wheel sharply and merged onto the busy highway, accelerating directly toward the gleaming glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. The battle had escalated far beyond a simple real estate dispute on a front porch. My son had drawn first blood in the financial arena, but I was about to unleash a devastating storm that would permanently obliterate his entire corporate reality. I parked my heavy truck in the underground garage of the downtown financial center, ignoring the reserved placards. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt agonizingly slow, but my pulse remained completely steady. I stepped out into the plush carpeted lobby of Sterling and Vance Legal Associates. The receptionist, a young woman who usually greeted me with a warm smile, stood up and opened her mouth to ask if I had an appointment. I did not stop walking. I bypassed her polished oak desk, entirely striding down the quiet corridor with a singular, unyielding focus. I pushed open the heavy double doors to the corner office without knocking. Gregory sat behind his massive glass desk, a cup of coffee halfway to his mouth. We had known each other for 3 decades, and he immediately recognized the terrifying coldness in my eyes. He placed his coffee down and gestured to the leather chair opposite him. I did not sit. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the crumpled, red-stamped declination slips from the pharmacy and slammed them directly onto the center of his pristine glass desk. The sharp crack echoed through the spacious office. I informed him that Kendall had initiated a hostile financial siege. I explained the fabricated Adult Protective Services report, the malicious claims of severe cognitive decline, and the total lockdown of my joint checking and savings accounts. Gregory's expression hardened instantly. He pulled a secure laptop toward him, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced urgency. He stated that freezing personal accounts using elder abuse protocols was a highly aggressive maneuver, usually designed to paralyze a target before a much larger financial strike. He asked for my absolute silence as he bypassed standard consumer portals and logged directly into the secure federal banking registry to assess the total scope of Kendall's assault. The digital glow of the monitor illuminated Gregory's face as he pulled up my complete financial footprint. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the rapid clicking of his keyboard. Suddenly, Gregory stopped typing. He let out a long, heavy exhale and turned the laptop screen toward me. He pointed to a newly established corporate credit line that I had never seen before. Gregory explained that the frozen personal accounts were merely a calculated distraction, a smokescreen designed to keep my attention diverted, while a massive hemorrhage occurred elsewhere. Kendall had not just locked me out of my daily funds. My son had weaponized my pristine credit history and my social security number to secure a $2 million commercial loan. I stared at the staggering numbers on the screen, feeling a visceral twist of disgust. Gregory pulled up the origination documents attached to the loan profile. Kendall utilized his advanced accounting credentials to forge my signature across dozens of digital authorization forms, falsely listing me as the primary guarantor for a high-risk corporate venture. The beneficiary of this massive fraudulent cash injection was an entity named Pinnacle Elite Events, the luxury event planning agency owned and operated exclusively by Madison. Kendall had effectively mortgaged my entire identity to fund his wife's lavish corporate ambitions. They knew that an uneducated hardware store manager could never secure such capital, so they stole the identity of the former municipal director they secretly despised. Gregory explained that Kendall deliberately staged the morning eviction and the subsequent bank freeze to trigger a psychological collapse. They calculated that a frightened, financially starved 70-year-old man would scramble to beg for his basic checking accounts, completely overlooking a multi-million-dollar corporate liability buried in federal registries. They used my hard-earned Social Security number as their personal blank check, banking on my supposed ignorance to build Madison's empire. The sheer scale of the betrayal transformed my lingering sorrow into absolute crystallized rage. My son had tied my name to a catastrophic debt and then actively attempted to throw me onto the street to ensure I could never fight back. Gregory warned that the first repayment installment was due in exactly 2 days. If the payment failed, the bank would immediately initiate seizure protocols against my remaining visible assets. Kendall engineered a trap where I would either accept the massive debt or lose everything trying to untangle the fraud. Gregory leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. He reminded me of the extensive legal architecture we painstakingly constructed 20 years ago. When I was managing the city's chaotic zoning department, I witnessed countless families destroyed by sudden financial predators and greedy relatives. To prevent that exact scenario, Gregory and I buried my commercial real estate fortunes inside an impenetrable blind trust. We did not just hide the assets, we embedded aggressive financial tripwires throughout the legal framework. These hidden protocols were specifically designed to automatically trigger catastrophic legal consequences against anyone who attempted a hostile corporate theft against my portfolio. Kendall believed he was exploiting an unprotected, financially illiterate old man. He had zero knowledge of the sleeping giant beneath his feet. The trust was rigged with defensive mechanisms that required only my verbal authorization to activate a failsafe designed to obliterate unauthorized creditors and fraudulent claimants instantly. I had spent decades shielding Kendall from the brutal realities of wealth, hoping he would build his own legacy. Instead, his unearned privilege blinded him to the invisible fortifications protecting my life's work. He stepped blindly into a legal minefield. I looked at the forged signatures on the digital loan documents, recognizing the distinct arrogant loop of Kendall's handwriting. The time for paternal patience had officially expired. I looked Gregory directly in the eye and instructed him to initiate the financial guillotine. I ordered him to unseal the blind trust immediately and unleash the full weight of our defensive protocols. I authorized a ruthless, unsparing forensic audit against Madison's event planning business and every single account linked to her corporate entity. Gregory's expression grew intensely grave. He leaned across the desk, warning me that activating this specific protocol would bypass civil litigation entirely and trigger automatic federal alerts. He stated with absolute clarity that exposing a $2 million banking fraud would instantly draw the attention of federal investigators. He looked at me with deep sympathy, reminding me that Kendall was still my flesh and blood. He warned that pressing this button would invariably result in a lengthy federal prison sentence for my son and the total irreversible destruction of his life. The heavy silence filled the corner office as Gregory waited for me to reconsider, giving me one final chance to show mercy to the boy I had raised. I did not hesitate. I picked up a heavy silver pen from his desk, pulled the authorization waiver forward, and signed my name with firm, undeniable precision. I told Gregory to proceed with the audit immediately. I stated coldly that the boy I raised died the moment he locked his mother out in the freezing cold. I told my lawyer that I no longer had a son, only a thief who broke into my house, and thieves must face the absolute severity of the law. Madison stood in the center of her sprawling glass-walled corner office in the heart of the downtown business district. She wore a tailored ivory pantsuit, her wrists stacked with heavy gold bracelets purchased entirely with stolen money. She flashed a practiced, dazzling smile as she poured expensive vintage champagne into crystal flutes for a high-profile corporate client representing a major international tech firm. Sunlight flooded through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the plush velvet sofas and the imported marble coffee table. Madison handed the client a glass, casually gesturing to the panoramic view of the city skyline. She boasted loudly about the massive impending expansion of Pinnacle Elite Events, claiming she was opening 3 new regional branches before the end of the fiscal quarter. She leaned against her mahogany desk, crossing her ankles, and proudly credited the entire aggressive expansion to the sheer financial genius of her brilliant husband, Kendall. She spun a fabricated, glossy narrative describing Kendall as a master wealth strategist who had recently secured a highly exclusive multi-million-dollar funding package to elevate her luxury brand to global status. The corporate client nodded approvingly, taking a measured sip of champagne, completely captivated by the illusion of boundless legitimate wealth. Madison thrived intensely on this exact performance. She lived to project an aura of untouchable prestige, utterly convinced that the stolen $2 million sitting quietly in her corporate accounts made her utterly invincible. She picked up a silver knife to slice a piece of imported truffle cheese from a massive, elaborate charcuterie board resting on the marble table, preparing to finalize a highly lucrative annual event contract. She believed she had officially arrived at the absolute pinnacle of high society, entirely unaware that the heavy blade of the financial guillotine had already dropped. The heavy frosted glass door of the luxury office swung open with a violent, jarring crack that instantly shattered the sophisticated atmosphere. A broad-shouldered process server in a dark, unwrinkled suit marched directly past Madison's frantic receptionist. He did not knock, and he did not offer a polite greeting or a standard introduction. He carried a massive 3-inch thick legal binder bound with heavy red security tape. Madison dropped her silver knife, her manicured hands flying angrily to her hips. She demanded to know who he was and threatened to call building security immediately to have him forcibly removed for interrupting a closed-door executive meeting. The man ignored her outrage completely. He strode straight to the imported marble coffee table and slammed the heavy legal binder directly onto the center of the elaborate charcuterie board. Crystal champagne flutes rattled violently against the impact. Imported meats, expensive cheeses, and shattered porcelain scattered across the pristine white carpet. The corporate client flinched instinctively, backing away from the sudden destruction. The process server looked Madison dead in the eye and stated clearly that she was officially served. He announced loudly that the documents contained an immediate non-negotiable termination of her commercial lease agreement. Madison shrieked frantically, wiping spilled wine from her ivory suit, screaming that her rent was paid a full year in advance using verified corporate funds. The server crossed his arms and delivered Gregory's meticulously prepared legal strike. He informed her and the silently listening client that the funding utilized to secure the commercial lease was flagged by federal banking authorities as the direct product of massive identity theft and wire fraud. He pointed to the top document in the binder, which explicitly detailed how Kendall had forged a $2 million commercial loan using stolen credentials to capitalize Pinnacle elite events. He stated that the building management group possessed a strict morality and fraud clause in all commercial leases. Because her agency was officially operating on stolen, highly illegal capital, her tenancy was immediately and permanently voided. He ordered her to vacate the premises and remove all unattached physical property within exactly 2 hours, or the local sheriff's department would arrive to physically padlock the glass doors and seize the remaining assets as vital evidence in the pending federal fraud investigation. Madison stood entirely frozen, her mouth opening and closing silently as the devastating reality of her sudden commercial eviction crashed into her meticulously curated world. Madison had spent the entirety of her 5-year marriage to Kendall openly mocking my blue-collar appearance. At every family dinner, she would pointedly turn her nose up at my calloused hands, my faded denim jackets, and my heavy steel-toed work boots. She repeatedly told Kendall that I was a pathetic, uneducated relic of a dead industrial era who entirely lacked the required vision to succeed in the modern corporate world. She firmly believed that my grueling physical labor equated to profound financial ignorance. She assumed my persistent frugality meant I could never grasp the complexities of high-level asset management or commercial real estate. Because of her blinding arrogance and superficial judgment, she never bothered to research the anonymous corporate entity that managed her luxury high-rise. She had absolutely no idea that 20 years ago I used the massive profits from a municipal zoning buyout to establish a highly fortified private holding company. She had no idea that my specific holding company owned the exact commercial skyscraper she operated her fraudulent business out of. She was literally paying her exorbitant monthly rent directly into my corporate accounts while laughing at my dirty work shirts. The wealthy corporate client did not wait for Madison to offer a frantic, desperate explanation. He set his crystal champagne flute down on a side table with a sharp, disgusted click. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket, stated clearly that his tech firm would never associate with a criminal enterprise under active federal investigation, and walked rapidly out the glass doors without looking back. Madison watched her most lucrative business-saving contract vanish into the hallway. The illusion of her untouchable empire evaporated instantly, leaving her standing alone in a pathetic puddle of spilled wine and ruined cheese. She scrambled across the floor, grabbed her smartphone with shaking hands, and frantically dialed Kendall. The moment he answered, she unleashed a hysterical, venomous scream. She shrieked that a process server had just humiliated her in front of a vital client and was threatening to lock her out of her own headquarters with police assistance. Kendall listened to the horrific details of the lease termination and the exposed loan fraud in dead silence. The blood drained completely from his face as he sat in his home office. The sheer speed, surgical precision, and overwhelming legality of the counterattack shattered his arrogant confidence. He realized with absolute terror that I was not a confused old man reacting defensively to a bank freeze. He realized I was fighting back with a highly organized, weaponized legal infrastructure and unprecedented financial resources. Cornered, bankrupt, and desperate to regain control of his furious wife and his rapidly collapsing life, Kendall realized he could not defeat me in a financial courtroom. He decided to bypass the money entirely and attack my physical freedom. He slammed his phone down and immediately began plotting a devastating, inescapable medical ambush, to forcibly strip my autonomy before federal investigators could process the fraud charges. I steered my rusted pickup truck onto our street, the engine rumbling low and steady. As I approached my driveway, a harsh glare of flashing red and white lights reflected against the brick facade of my home. A sleek, privately contracted ambulance was parked aggressively on the property, its heavy tires tearing deep, muddy trenches straight through Brenda's meticulously manicured front lawn. The heavy front door of the house stood wide open, letting the cold air sweep into the hallway. I killed the engine, my grip tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white. I stepped out, my heavy boots thudding against the pavement, and walked up the front steps. Inside the living room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense and hostile. Kendall stood rigid by the brick fireplace, adjusting his cuffs, exuding a desperate manic energy that betrayed his severe panic. Standing directly beside my son was an older man in a tailored clinical suit, clutching a leather medical briefcase. Flanking them both were two massive, broad-shouldered orderlies dressed in stark white scrubs. One of the men casually tapped a set of thick, heavy nylon restraints against his thigh. Brenda sat huddled in her floral armchair, weeping silently, completely paralyzed by the sudden invasion. Kendall pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at my chest the exact moment I crossed the threshold. He loudly announced to the medical personnel that the dangerous, unpredictable patient had finally returned. The calculated intrusion was brilliantly malicious, completely designed to bypass standard law enforcement and use the healthcare system as a weapon of sheer brute force. I did not flinch or raise my voice. I stepped fully into the room, closed the door firmly behind me, and locked my gaze onto the medical team standing uninvited in my personal sanctuary. Kendall stepped forward, his voice dripping with a sickeningly fabricated tone of deep grief and exhausted filial duty. He handed the private psychiatrist a thick stack of printed medical paperwork. Kendall loudly claimed these were verified behavioral reports proving that I was suffering from violent late-stage dementia. He spun a masterful, deeply tragic narrative for the clinical team. He stated that I had been suffering from severe aggressive delusions, actively threatening our neighbors, and senselessly hoarding dangerous items in the garage. He told the doctor that my mental state had drastically deteriorated overnight into pure violent paranoia, and that I was completely detached from reality. He pointed a dramatic finger at Brenda, falsely claiming that I had recently threatened her life and that she was currently too terrified to speak out against her abuser. Kendall aggressively demanded the psychiatrist sign an immediate 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold. He insisted that I was an imminent deadly threat to my frail wife and myself, commanding the orderlies to apply the heavy nylon restraints and drag me into the waiting ambulance for my own physical safety. The psychiatrist flipped rapidly through the forged behavioral logs, his brow furrowed with deep professional concern. He looked up at me clearly, assessing my dirty work coveralls, my rough, calloused hands, and my silent, stoic demeanor as highly probable symptoms of severe cognitive neglect. Kendall frantically urged the team to move quickly, claiming I was highly prone to sudden, unpredictable physical outbursts and had to be institutionalized immediately before a fatal tragedy occurred. The two massive orderlies exchanged a brief tactical look and stepped forward in perfect unison, their rubber soles squeaking loudly against the polished hardwood floor. They sternly instructed me to remain perfectly still, place my hands behind my back, and cooperate peacefully with the medical transfer. Kendall stood safely in the background, a triumphant, malicious sneer beginning to form on his pale face. He truly believed he had discovered the ultimate legal loophole. If I was declared legally incompetent and locked securely inside a psychiatric ward, all of my aggressive financial actions from the past 24 hours would be instantly nullified. He would automatically gain emergency medical conservatorship over my entire estate, effectively overriding the trust protocols and permanently reversing Madison's commercial eviction. The sheer, unfathomable evil of his strategy was breathtaking. He was entirely willing to strip away my basic human rights, drug me into silent compliance, and leave me rotting in a sterile medical facility just to maintain his stolen corporate wealth. Working in upper-level municipal city administration for 4 decades taught me a profound, invaluable lesson about ruthless corporate predators. When greedy developers and corrupt contractors cannot win a fight through legitimate financial channels, they immediately pivot to underhanded bureaucratic attacks to disable their opponents. I spent my entire professional career anticipating and neutralizing malicious legal ambushes from people desperate to bypass the law. I knew Kendall would quickly realize he was losing the financial war, and attempt to leverage the state's healthcare system against me. Because of this deeply ingrained tactical paranoia, I did not spend my morning resting after leaving Gregory's office. I drove my truck directly to the state's most prestigious, highly secure neurological facility. I bypassed the standard waiting lists using old municipal favors, and spent 4 grueling hours undergoing a comprehensive, absolutely exhaustive cognitive examination. I sat through rigorous memory stress tests, advanced psychological evaluations, and extensive neurological brain scans administered by the absolute top medical professionals in the region. I ensured every single test was heavily documented, officially certified, and legally witnessed by multiple objective authorities. Kendall severely underestimated the sheer discipline required to manage a city's infrastructure. I always secured my legal permits before ever breaking ground. As the larger orderly reached out to grab my wrist with the heavy restraints, I calmly raised my left hand to halt his advance. I reached inside the deep interior pocket of my heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a pristine, sealed medical envelope. I handed it directly to the private psychiatrist, instructing him to review the contents before he made a career-ending medical error. The doctor opened the envelope, pulling out the thick stack of official hospital records. His eyes scanned the crisp, date-stamped, and legally certified neurological evaluation. He saw the undeniable, flawless cognitive scores. He saw the authentic signature of the hospital's highly respected chief of staff at the bottom of the comprehensive clearance form. The blood drained completely from the psychiatrist's face. He realized instantly that Kendall had fed him entirely fabricated information and violently manipulated him into attempting a highly illegal, career-destroying medical kidnapping. The doctor shoved the forged behavioral logs back into Kendall's chest, his voice shaking with absolute professional outrage. He warned my son that he would be personally filing a severe fraud report with the medical licensing board regarding this malicious stunt. He ordered his orderlies to stand down immediately. The medical team marched out of my house furiously, slamming the front door behind them and driving their ambulance off my lawn. Kendall stood completely frozen in the center of the living room, his ultimate trap entirely dismantled by a single piece of paper. He realized his father was an impenetrable fortress. His panic morphed into a blind, animalistic fury. He turned to me, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. He screamed that if he could not own the property, no one ever would. He looked me dead in the eye and violently vowed to burn the entire house to the ground before the night was over. Then he turned and sprinted out the door into the fading evening light. The morning air was crisp and painfully cold. I stood in the kitchen pouring a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, hoping for a single hour of peace after the absolute chaos of the medical ambush. The heavy silence of the house was violently shattered by the sharp, authoritative pounding on my front door. I set my ceramic mug down on the granite counter and walked purposefully down the hallway. I pulled the heavy oak door open to find a tall, rigidly postured man in a dark charcoal suit standing on my porch. He clutched a thick leather briefcase and wore an expression of practiced, bureaucratic, absolute detachment. He introduced himself as a senior asset recovery agent operating on behalf of the federal banking institution that held the $2 million commercial note. Without a single word of polite preamble, he thrust a thick, yellow-tabbed envelope directly into my hands. It was a formal, expedited notice of total property foreclosure. The documents boldly stated that the massive commercial loan fraudulently secured under my stolen Social Security number had gone into immediate catastrophic default. Kendall had deliberately tanked the enormous first payment. He intentionally triggered the automated federal seizure protocols, knowing the bank would aggressively target the listed guarantor to recoup their massive losses. My son was using the sheer unyielding momentum of a major financial institution as a blunt weapon to crush me. The agent demanded that I acknowledge the default, stating that the bank was legally authorized to seize the physical estate and all attached liquid assets to satisfy the corporate debt. The sheer scale of Kendall's destructive scorched earth tactic was laid bare in harsh black ink. I did not immediately respond to the agent's harsh demands. Instead, my gaze drifted past his dark suit, looking out across the frost-covered expanse of my front lawn. Parked aggressively across the street, half-mounted on the public sidewalk, was a gleaming silver luxury sports car. The driver's side tinted window was rolled down just enough to reveal the occupant. Kendall sat reclined against the expensive leather upholstery, gripping a disposable coffee cup. A sickening, triumphant smirk was plastered across his pale face. He had parked there specifically to watch the destruction of my life unfold in real time. He was eagerly waiting for the federal bank official to forcibly remove me from the premises. He wanted to witness the exact moment I was forced to carry Brenda out of our warm sanctuary and onto the freezing street, destitute, humiliated, and entirely broken. The sheer, unfathomable malice required to sit in a luxury vehicle and gleefully anticipate the homelessness of your own parents was staggering. I observed the boy I had painstakingly taught to ride a bicycle on that exact stretch of pavement. I remembered working grueling 12-hour physical shifts in the pouring rain just to ensure his college tuition was paid in full. Now that same privileged boy was actively weaponizing a powerful financial institution to finish the brutal job his forged quitclaim deed and his corrupt, fraudulent psychiatrist had completely failed to accomplish. Kendall wanted me erased. He wanted my legacy liquidated to cover his corporate failures. He checked his heavy gold watch, his body language radiating intense, restless impatience. He tapped his fingers rhythmically against the steering wheel, waiting for the bank agent to call for local law enforcement to execute the physical eviction. He truly believed he had orchestrated a flawless, inescapable financial checkmate. He thought he had severed my last remaining lifeline and left me completely exposed to the unforgiving machinery of corporate debt collection. I stared at him, feeling no sorrow, only a cold, calculated resolve. Kendall assumed my silence in the doorway was the paralytic shock of a defeated old man. He assumed I was crumbling under the immense pressure of a $2 million liability. He took a slow, arrogant sip of his coffee, lifting the cup slightly in my direction in a mocking, silent toast to my absolute ruin. I did not panic, nor did I show a single ounce of fear. Working closely alongside Gregory to construct my impenetrable financial fortress decades ago taught me how to precisely anticipate the complex sequence of hostile corporate attacks. During our urgent meeting in his corner office just days prior, Gregory explicitly outlined this exact desperate scenario. Once we activated the financial guillotine and commenced the ruthless forensic audit against Madison's event planning agency, Kendall would instantly realize he was hopelessly cornered. Gregory accurately predicted that a trapped, bankrupt animal would deliberately default on the massive fraudulent loan, attempting to sink the entire ship and drag me down into the crushing depths with him. Because we anticipated this precise, destructive maneuver, the legal tripwires were already armed and waiting. Gregory and I had already filed a comprehensive, airtight federal identity theft complaint regarding the fraudulent loan origination. We legally severed my identity from Kendall's toxic corporate debt before the first payment was ever missed. I was not standing on the precipice of ruin. I was standing safely behind a massive wall of bulletproof federal documentation. I stepped back, opened the heavy oak door wider, and cordially invited the federal bank representative out of the freezing cold and into my warm study. I offered no desperate excuses and made no pathetic pleas for bureaucratic mercy. I simply walked behind my heavy mahogany desk, unlocked the bottom drawer, and extracted a thick red legal binder meticulously prepared by Gregory. I slid the documents across the polished wood directly into the agent's hands. I presented the date-stamped federal fraud docket and the certified IP address logs extracted during our aggressive forensic audit. The unyielding technical data proved undeniably that the digital loan authorization and the forged electronic signatures were executed directly from the secure, localized network inside Kendall's own luxury home office. The data proved the fraudulent transaction completely bypassed my personal devices and my geographic location. The bank representative read the certified federal complaint, his eyes tracking rapidly across the pages. His rigid professional demeanor shifted instantly from aggressive collection to stunned, furious realization. He understood immediately that his powerful institution had been weaponized in a massive, highly illegal wire fraud scheme orchestrated by the actual beneficiary of the funds. The agent snapped his leather briefcase shut with a sharp crack, apologized profusely for the unwarranted intrusion, and marched briskly out my front door with aggressive purpose. I stepped onto the porch, watching the scene unfold with absolute cold satisfaction. Across the street, Kendall's triumphant, arrogant smirk evaporated entirely. The furious bank official bypassed my property completely and strode directly toward the silver sports car. Kendall frantically attempted to roll up his tinted window, but the agent slapped the heavy foreclosure and federal fraud notices flat against the glass. The smug hunter had instantly become the desperate hunted prey. The digital clock on the bedside table shifted silently to midnight. The house rested in absolute darkness, wrapped in the freezing stillness of a neighborhood deep in sleep. A sudden sharp crash of shattering glass obliterated the quiet. The violent sound echoed clearly from the back kitchen, followed instantly by the heavy thud of a man landing on the linoleum floor. I sat up in bed, my pulse steady and perfectly controlled. I did not rush. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress and stepped into my heavy work boots. I walked down the carpeted hallway, placing each footstep carefully to avoid the floorboards I knew would creak. The intruder moved with frantic, clumsy urgency. Through the archway, I observed a figure dressed entirely in black tactical clothing, a dark hood pulled low over his forehead. He clutched a heavy rusted steel crowbar tightly in his right hand. The moonlight spilling through the broken kitchen window illuminated his face just enough for me to confirm what I already knew. It was Kendall. My son had returned to the home he tried to steal, bypassing the front porch and breaking in like a common street thief. He ignored the valuable electronics in the living room and the expensive silver in the dining hutch. He moved with singular, desperate purpose straight toward the back corridor. He was heading directly for my private study. He moved like a hunted animal, his breathing shallow and rapid, terrified of the federal net closing in entirely around him. He gripped the crowbar so hard his knuckles shone white in the gloom. He stepped into the study, fully unaware that he was walking blindly into a meticulously prepared enclosure. Kendall dropped heavily to his knees in the center of the study. He frantically shoved my heavy oak desk aside, uncaring as the wood screeched harshly against the floorboards. He clawed at the Persian rug, ripping it back to expose the solid steel cover of the floor safe. He wedged the flat edge of his crowbar under the thick metal rim and leaned his entire body weight against the iron shaft. He grunted with sheer physical exertion, his face flushed dark red with absolute desperation. The bank representative had clearly delivered the reality of his situation earlier that afternoon. Kendall knew federal investigators were actively assembling a massive fraud case against him. He knew they would immediately subpoena the original trust deed and the federal land patent to prove he maliciously forged the property transfer. He had broken into his childhood home to physically destroy the only tangible evidence that could permanently lock him inside a federal penitentiary. He drove the crowbar deeper into the steel casing, chipping the concrete foundation in his manic frenzy. I stood silently in the doorway, watching the pathetic spectacle of a cornered coward trying to pry open a vault he had no right to touch. In my right hand, I held a massive solid steel wrench I had retrieved from my garage workbench earlier that evening. The cold metal grounded me. I could have easily stepped forward and shattered his kneecap. I could have brought the heavy steel down across his collarbone to end his violent intrusion instantly. I did not raise the weapon. I did not issue a warning or shout a furious reprimand. I simply reached out and flicked the brass switch on the wall. The bright overhead chandelier flooded the room with harsh, unforgiving light. Kendall froze completely. The crowbar slipped from his sweaty grip, clattering loudly against the iron safe cover. He slowly turned his head, his eyes widening in absolute terror as he stared up at me. He looked at the heavy wrench in my hand, bracing his body for a brutal physical impact. I remained perfectly still, blocking the only exit, watching him choke on his own paralyzing fear. He stayed pinned to the floor, panting heavily, realizing he was entirely trapped by the man he had spent the last 2 days actively trying to destroy. His grand corporate strategy had degenerated into breaking and entering. Working decades in city planning taught me precisely how desperate men behave when their fraudulent empires collapse. The moment the bank representative handed Kendall the federal fraud docket, I knew a physical assault on my property was entirely inevitable. A man facing imminent federal prison time will always attempt to destroy the primary evidence. Because I anticipated this exact violent break-in, I did not leave my fate to chance. 3 days ago, immediately after my meeting with Gregory, I emptied the floor safe of all genuine legal documents. I transported the authentic trust deed, the federal land patent, and my emergency cash reserves to a highly secure off-site private vault. I deliberately left the heavy floor safe completely empty, save for one specific item. I placed a single thick red folder directly in the center of the steel compartment. The folder looked incredibly official, stuffed with watermarked paper and bound with heavy legal clips. I engineered a trap designed specifically for a thief seeking a rapid, miraculous escape from justice. I knew Kendall would not have the time or the composure to read the documents in the dark. He would simply grab the bait and run blindly into the night. Kendall stared at the heavy steel wrench in my hand, his chest heaving as pure adrenaline flooded his system. He looked down at the floor safe, which he had successfully pried open just an inch during his frantic assault. Through the narrow gap, the bright edge of the thick red folder caught the overhead light. His eyes darted from the folder back to my face. He made a split-second, wildly desperate calculation. He kicked his legs out, lunging forward with a guttural shout. He shoved his bleeding fingers into the cracked safe, violently ripping the heavy red folder from the steel compartment. He clutched the bait tightly against his chest, expecting me to swing the heavy wrench to stop his escape. I simply stepped sideways, clearing the doorway completely. Kendall scrambled to his feet, slipping frantically on the hardwood floor. He bolted past me, his shoulder slamming hard against the doorframe, and sprinted down the hallway. I listened to his heavy footsteps crashing through the kitchen, followed by the sound of him hurling himself through the shattered back door and out into the freezing darkness of the yard. I did not chase him. I walked slowly into the kitchen, my boots crunching over the broken glass. I closed the damaged door, engaged the secondary deadbolt calmly, and placed my wrench quietly on the counter. Kendall was currently running through the neighborhood shadows, clutching that red folder like a victorious trophy. He truly believed he had just stolen the keys to the entire empire and secured his permanent freedom from federal prosecution. He was completely unaware that he had just swallowed pure, concentrated legal poison. He had taken the exact bait Gregory and I designed to obliterate his remaining freedom, accelerating his own inevitable destruction with his own two hands. While I methodically swept the shattered glass from my kitchen linoleum, Kendall was actively cementing his own destruction across town. He drove his sports car recklessly through the deserted, rain-slicked city streets, blowing through red traffic lights in a desperate, manic rush to reach the downtown financial district. He slammed his brakes in front of a narrow, nondescript building squeezed between two towering corporate high-rises. Leaving the engine idling and the driver's side door wide open, he sprinted toward the entrance. He clutched the heavy red folder tightly against his chest like a stolen crown. He took the concrete stairs 2 at a time to the 3rd floor, bypassing the dark reception area entirely, and burst violently through the frosted glass door of his private attorney's office. Vance Sterling, a lawyer known strictly for handling quiet, under-the-table corporate liquidations, jumped in his plush leather chair. Kendall did not apologize for the midnight intrusion. He marched directly to the center of the room, his breath coming in ragged, erratic gasps, and slapped the thick red folder violently onto the polished mahogany desk. The heavy thud echoed sharply in the quiet room. Kendall leaned heavily over the desk, his eyes wild and bloodshot with pure adrenaline. He barked an absolute, non-negotiable command. He demanded Vance execute a hostile immediate takeover of my entire estate. He claimed the folder contained the original unalterable blind trust documents and the master land patents that proved his legal right to everything I owned. He ordered his lawyer to prepare the paperwork the very second the courthouse opened, legally transferring all my assets into his name and permanently severing my control before federal investigators could intervene. Vance adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses, clearly irritated by the chaotic midnight ambush, but the sheer desperation radiating from Kendall's voice forced his compliance. He reached out with manicured hands, untied the thick legal cord binding the red folder, and began to read the top page. Kendall paced the length of the office like a caged predator, rubbing his bruised shoulder and muttering frantic, fragmented plans about liquidating my commercial real estate to instantly clear his massive corporate debts. He boasted loudly that he had outsmarted my defensive tripwires, completely convinced that possessing the physical documents equated to absolute unchecked power over my life's work. As Kendall continued his arrogant, manic monologue, a profound silence overtook the room. Vance had stopped turning the pages. The lawyer sat frozen in his high-backed leather chair, his eyes locked onto a specific paragraph embedded deep within the watermarked paper. The arrogant, composed demeanor of the shady attorney evaporated entirely. A visible bead of cold sweat formed at his temple and rolled slowly down his jawline. His hands began to tremble violently, causing the crisp pages to rattle loudly in the quiet office. Suddenly, Vance dropped the documents as if they were literally engulfed in flames. He shoved his chair backwards so hard the wheels screeched against the hardwood floor, putting as much physical distance between himself and the red folder as the small room allowed. Kendall stopped pacing, his manic grin faltering. He demanded to know what the problem was, commanding his lawyer to stop acting like a coward and process the takeover. Vance looked at Kendall, not with professional respect, but with absolute, crystallized horror. He pointed a shaking finger at the scattered papers on his desk. He informed Kendall that those were not standard trust documents. The pages were laced with a highly aggressive, deeply hidden legal tracking clause. He explained with a cracking voice that the folder was a lethal financial bear trap. By physically possessing those specific, federally watermarked papers and presenting them with the explicit intent to file, Kendall had just unknowingly triggered a catastrophic automatic alert. The documents were hard-coded with a self-executing federal injunction. Vance stated with absolute clarity that Kendall had not secured the estate. Instead, the moment these documents entered a legal office for filing, they triggered an irreversible automated federal freeze on every single asset connected to the presenter's name. When Gregory and I constructed the advanced architecture of my blind trust 2 decades ago, we anticipated that a hostile actor might eventually attempt to physically steal the documentation to force an illegal transfer. Gregory meticulously engineered that specific red folder to serve as a lethal legal honeypot. The documents inside were entirely legitimate in their formatting, but contained deeply buried, highly toxic covenants. To file those papers and claim control of the assets, the presenter was legally required to sign a sworn notarized affidavit of ownership under strict penalty of perjury. By bringing the stolen folder to his attorney and demanding a formal filing, Kendall firmly established his intent to commit massive federal perjury and corporate theft. The paperwork was specifically designed to act as a digital tripwire within the national banking system. Any attorney attempting to process the transfer would be legally obligated to submit the watermarked tracking codes into the state registry, which immediately notified federal fraud monitors. Kendall had eagerly snatched the bait, entirely oblivious to the hidden hooks waiting to tear his life apart. He believed he was executing a masterstroke, completely unaware he was finalizing his own demise. Kendall stared at Vance, his mind violently rejecting the horrifying reality of the lawyer's words. He opened his mouth to argue, to demand a workaround, but the sound was abruptly cut off by a sharp, persistent buzzing from his dark jacket pocket. Kendall reached inside and pulled out his smartphone. The glowing screen was completely illuminated by a rapid, unending cascade of automated notifications. They were high-priority security alerts from his primary financial institutions. He watched in paralyzed silence as the incoming messages confirmed the total devastation of his wealth. His platinum checking account was frozen instantly. His high-yield stock portfolios were entirely locked. His emergency savings and every single personal credit line were seized by federal banking authorities pending a massive criminal fraud investigation. The digital tripwire had detonated with flawless surgical precision, severing him from his money in a matter of seconds. Before he could even process the staggering notifications, the phone began to ring loudly in his hand. The caller ID flashed Madison's name. Kendall answered the call mechanically, holding the device to his ear. He was instantly met with the sound of his wife shrieking in pure, unadulterated panic. Madison screamed that she was standing at a luxury hotel front desk, entirely humiliated because every single one of her premium corporate credit cards was declining. She shrieked that the bank representatives told her the accounts were completely liquidated and seized under federal forfeiture protocols. She demanded that he fix the situation immediately, her voice breaking into hysterical sobs. Kendall did not answer her. He slowly lowered the phone, the dial tone ringing out into the dead silence of the lawyer's office. He stared blankly at the red folder resting on the mahogany desk. He had lost everything. He was completely, undeniably bankrupt. The heavy oak door of my home had barely remained locked for an hour when the frantic, rhythmic pounding began. I stood in the hallway, the harsh glare of the porch light cutting through the frosted glass panels. I pulled the deadbolt back and opened the door. Madison stood on the top step, shivering violently in the freezing midnight air. The pristine, untouchable aura she meticulously projected during her corporate meetings was completely obliterated. Her expensive ivory pantsuit was crumpled and heavily stained with spilled wine from her disastrous commercial eviction. Dark, thick streaks of ruined designer mascara ran down her cheeks, pooling at the edges of her trembling jaw. She clutched her luxury leather handbag to her chest like a physical shield, completely abandoning her usual posture of extreme arrogance. She did not sneer or look past me with her typical aristocratic disdain. She looked directly into my eyes, her face twisted in an expression of raw, unadulterated panic. She begged me to let her inside, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. She claimed she was absolutely terrified, stating that federal agents had just raided her hotel suite and seized her remaining luggage. She shrieked that Kendall had completely lost his mind, abandoning her in the city after his corporate accounts were frozen. I stood perfectly still, blocking the threshold with my body. I did not step aside. I did not offer her a warm coat or a comforting word. I observed her theatrical desperation with absolute emotional detachment. She reached out with shaking manicured fingers, attempting to grab the sleeve of my heavy work jacket. I took a deliberate step backward, keeping the physical distance between us exactly as it was. I commanded her to speak her piece from the porch. Madison dropped her hand, realizing the tactic of physical affection would yield absolutely zero results. She instantly shifted her strategy, pivoting from a terrified wife to a calculating informant. She wiped the smeared makeup from her eyes, her sobbing abruptly replaced by a frantic transactional sharpness. She claimed she was a complete victim of Kendall's massive financial delusions. She spun a rapid, desperate narrative insisting she had absolutely no knowledge of the forged commercial loan or the fabricated Adult Protective Services report. She pointed a trembling finger toward the dark street, declaring that Kendall manipulated her into utilizing the stolen funds to expand her luxury event planning agency. She claimed he isolated her from the financial records and forced her to sign corporate documents under extreme marital duress. It was a masterful, entirely fabricated performance designed to absolve her of all criminal liability. Madison leaned closer to the doorframe, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper. She offered me a direct, highly illegal bargain. She stated she possessed digital copies of Kendall's internal ledgers, the exact documents proving he deliberately orchestrated the bank fraud and the identity theft. She promised to deliver the hard drives directly to Gregory and formally testify against her husband in a federal courtroom, guaranteeing Kendall would face decades in a penitentiary. In exchange for handing me the definitive weapon to destroy my son, she demanded total financial and legal immunity. She required me to instantly liquidate a portion of my blind trust to pay off the staggering commercial debts she accrued under Pinnacle Elite Events. She demanded I utilize my corporate attorneys to completely shield her from the impending federal indictments, ensuring she walked away from the wreckage with her personal wealth and her pristine social reputation entirely intact. She demanded I purchase her testimony, essentially asking the man she tried to leave homeless to fund her escape. She looked at me with a desperate, calculating hunger, entirely convinced that my lingering paternal rage toward Kendall would blind me to her own immense culpability. She thought I would eagerly pay any price to secure the final nail in my son's coffin. Madison fundamentally misunderstood the scope of my defensive architecture. When a man spends 40 years navigating the treacherous landscape of municipal zoning and corporate city planning, he learns that verbal promises are entirely worthless. Survival relies exclusively on irrefutable documented evidence. The morning after Kendall and Madison initiated their first bureaucratic attack by attempting to freeze my accounts and evict Brenda, I did not just secure my financial assets, I immediately fortified my physical perimeter. I contracted a private security firm to install a network of military-grade high-definition audio and video cameras seamlessly integrated into the eaves of my roof and the framework of my front porch. The microscopic lenses captured every single movement and recorded every spoken syllable with crystal-clear precision. I did not rely on Madison's sudden, convenient willingness to testify. I already possessed absolute surveillance dominance over my own property. I recorded her entire desperate confession, her blatant extortion attempt, and her eager willingness to commit perjury to save her own skin. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I did not entertain her extortion attempt or engage in a debate over her fabricated innocence. I simply unlocked the screen, synced the device to the porch security system, and pressed play on an archived audio file. The crisp, high-definition recording echoed loudly into the freezing night air. It was a conversation captured exactly 2 days ago, right on this very porch, just moments before the initial bank freeze. Madison's own voice played back to her, dripping with venomous arrogance. The recording captured her laughing alongside Kendall, gleefully calling Brenda a disposable old maid who deserved to die rotting in a sterile state home. It captured her explicitly instructing Kendall to maximize the fraudulent commercial loan so she could purchase a secondary vacation property. The digital evidence completely obliterated her fragile narrative of being an innocent, manipulated victim. I stopped the recording and looked her dead in the eye. I stated with absolute freezing clarity that I do not negotiate with corporate parasites. I formally rejected her deal and ordered her off my property. The realization that she possessed zero leverage completely shattered her sanity. Madison's eyes widened in pure feral rage. She let out a guttural shriek, grabbing the collar of her expensive ivory blouse and violently ripping the fabric straight down the center. She dug her sharp, manicured fingernails directly into her own forearms, dragging them down the skin until deep, bloody scratches appeared. She yanked her phone from her handbag and dialed emergency services. As the dispatcher answered, Madison threw herself backward onto the cold concrete of the porch, screaming hysterically into the receiver that I had just brutally assaulted her and was actively trying to kill her. The wailing sirens pierced the freezing night air less than 3 minutes after Madison disconnected her frantic emergency call. Twin beams of blinding headlights swept aggressively across my frost-covered front lawn as 2 municipal police cruisers skidded to a violent halt against the curb. The heavy vehicle doors flew open in perfect unison. 4 officers swarmed out, their service weapons drawn and their tactical flashlights cutting sharply through the absolute darkness. They were responding to an active, violent domestic assault in progress, and their adrenaline was visibly surging. The lead officer barked a harsh, booming command for everyone to freeze and keep their hands perfectly visible. Madison executed her fabricated role with chilling theatrical perfection. She remained sprawled across the cold concrete of my front porch, her expensive ivory pantsuit torn straight down the middle and her arms violently covered in deep, bleeding scratches. She cowered against the brick railing, sobbing with loud, breathless gasps that echoed over the sharp crackle of the police radios. When the bright flashlight beams hit her tear-stained, ruined face, she raised a violently trembling arm and pointed a bloody finger directly at my chest. She shrieked that I had brutally attacked her the moment she arrived to peacefully ask for financial help. She claimed I physically dragged her by her hair, ripped her clothing in a blind rage, and attempted to throw her over the banister when she threatened to expose my corporate secrets. The officers moved with immediate, aggressive, tactical precision, completely trusting the horrific visual evidence presented by the weeping, bleeding woman on the ground. They ordered me to step away from the doorway and drop to my knees. I did not resist their commands. I kept my hands raised in plain sight, my face entirely devoid of fear, while the flashing blue and red lights illuminated Madison's phenomenal performance. The 2 largest officers advanced rapidly up the porch steps, holstering their firearms and reaching to unclip their heavy steel handcuffs. They grabbed my arms with unyielding professional force, twisting my wrists behind my back and shoving me roughly against the cold brick facade of my own home. The cold metal clasped tightly around my wrists, biting sharply into my skin. I did not struggle or utter a single word of protest, allowing them to secure me completely. The loud commotion drew Brenda from the warmth of the living room. She appeared in the open doorway, clutching her thick wool shawl tightly around her frail shoulders. She stared in absolute, uncomprehending horror as the police pinned her husband against the wall like a common street criminal. The lead officer instructed Brenda to remain inside for her own physical safety, stating firmly that the porch was an active crime scene investigation. Another officer knelt beside Madison, wrapping a thick thermal blanket around her shivering shoulders and speaking in soft, comforting tones to de-escalate her panic. Madison buried her face in the officer's shoulder, weeping uncontrollably about her absolute terror and her physical pain. However, as the officer turned his head to call for a medical unit over his radio, Madison shifted her gaze slightly over his dark uniform. She looked directly at me, securely pinned against the brickwork. Through the curtain of her ruined designer makeup and her fabricated tears, a sickening, triumphant smirk crawled across her lips. It was a look of pure, venomous victory. She was entirely confident that her horrific performance would instantly result in an aggravated felony assault charge. Madison calculated that the immediate threat of a lengthy prison sentence and the total destruction of my public reputation would utterly paralyze me. She firmly believed that by tomorrow morning, Gregory and I would be scrambling to draft a massive financial settlement just to keep her quiet and keep me out of a federal penitentiary. She assumed I would easily surrender millions of dollars from the blind trust to avoid dying behind bars. She was weaponizing the justice system exactly as Kendall had attempted to weaponize the psychiatric system, completely convinced that her physical wounds were absolute, undeniable proof of her victimization. She thought the game was over, entirely oblivious to the silent digital sentinels watching from above. Decades spent fighting corrupt city contractors and dodging malicious bureaucratic traps taught me that an enemy will always target the blind spots of your primary defense. When I fortified my property following Kendall's initial eviction attempt, I knew standard perimeter surveillance was entirely insufficient against highly motivated, calculating predators. While the visible security cameras installed under the roof eaves captured the broad, undeniable events of the front lawn and the driveway, they possessed a slight structural vulnerability. The deep awning of the porch cast heavy shadows directly against the front door, obscuring the precise, minute details of close-quarters physical interactions. To completely eliminate this fatal blind spot, I personally installed a secondary microscopic high-definition lens directly inside the brass framework of the front door. This concealed, secondary unit featured advanced infrared tracking and was specifically calibrated to capture an unobstructed, wide-angle view of the immediate threshold in crystal-clear resolution. I knew a desperate adversary would eventually attempt to use my own porch as a staging ground for a fabricated physical assault. Gregory validated this exact protocol, warning me that financial predators often pivot to personal injury claims when cornered. The hidden lens guaranteed that absolutely no physical interaction within 5 feet of my entryway could ever be manipulated, contested, or falsely reported. I turned my head away from the cold brick and looked directly at the lead officer standing beside my shoulder. I maintained a perfectly calm, deeply measured tone as I informed him that I was the sole owner of the property and that his squad was actively arresting the wrong person. I instructed him to look at the small black digital tablet resting on the wrought iron patio table just 3 feet away. I told the officer that the tablet was actively synced to a concealed security network and contained the exact unedited footage of the entire incident from multiple overlapping angles. The lead officer frowned, clearly skeptical of a violent suspect offering digital alibis, but his rigorous professional training dictated he verify the claim. He stepped over to the patio table, tapped the illuminated screen, and pressed play on the most recent date-stamped file. The high-definition footage played clearly over the tablet's speakers. The audio captured Madison's desperate extortion attempt with flawless, undeniable precision. Then the visual shifted to the concealed doorframe camera. The officers watched in stunned, absolute silence as the high-resolution video proved I never moved from the threshold. They watched Madison violently rip her own expensive blouse and viciously dig her manicured nails into her own forearms while I stood completely motionless 10 feet away. The undeniable digital evidence completely unraveled her malicious lie in a matter of seconds. The lead officer immediately produced a small silver key and unlocked my heavy steel cuffs, profusely apologizing for the physical restraint. He turned his attention sharply toward the porch floor. Madison's triumphant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, breathless terror as the officer pulled her roughly to her feet. The police informed Madison that she was under formal immediate arrest for filing a false police report, aggravated perjury, and attempted criminal extortion. They locked the heavy steel cuffs around her bleeding wrists and dragged her toward the waiting cruiser. The sharp, shrill ringing of my secure desktop phone cut through the quiet of my study exactly at dawn. I recognized the automated prefix of the county correctional facility immediately. I pressed the speaker button, leaning back in my leather chair as the robotic voice prompted me to accept a collect call from an inmate. I accepted the charge. Kendall's voice flooded the room, echoing with the hollow metallic acoustics of the bleak concrete lobby of the county jail. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask about Brenda or express a single ounce of remorse for the violent spectacle his wife had just orchestrated on my front porch. He sounded entirely frantic, his breath hitching, as he demanded I wire $50,000 directly to a local bail bondsman. He ordered me to secure Madison's immediate release, claiming the holding cells were unsanitary and that his wife was suffering a severe panic attack. He barked the instructions with his usual arrogant entitlement, completely ignoring the reality that Madison had just attempted to frame me for a violent felony. He truly believed he could simply command me to open my wallet and clean up the catastrophic legal wreckage they had generated. He insisted the transfer needed to happen within the hour, claiming the processing window was closing, and Madison would be transferred to the general population if I delayed. I listened to his frantic demands, my expression completely neutral. I reminded him calmly that Madison was currently facing multiple felony charges for filing a false police report, aggravated perjury, and attempted extortion against the very man he was now ordering to pay her bail. I stated clearly that my financial resources would never be used to rescue criminals from the consequences of their own malicious actions. The line fell dead silent for a moment as the reality of my absolute refusal registered in Kendall's mind. When he spoke again, the frantic desperation was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating venom. Kendall realized instantly that his usual tactics of intimidation and physical threats were entirely useless against the fortified legal walls Gregory and I had erected. He immediately pivoted his strategy, opting for a vicious character assassination. He lowered his voice into a harsh, menacing hiss. He threatened to contact a network of aggressive local journalists he had cultivated during his time as a corporate wealth manager. He vowed to feed them a highly fabricated, sensationalized narrative designed to completely obliterate my pristine community reputation. Kendall outlined his malicious blackmail scheme with chilling precision. He promised to provide the press with manipulated property records, falsely painting me as a ruthless, illegal slumlord who used shell companies to violently evict low-income and minority families from their homes. He claimed he would frame the commercial eviction of Madison's luxury event planning agency as a targeted attack against a young female-owned enterprise. He explicitly detailed how the media would eagerly devour a story about a wealthy, tyrannical patriarch crushing marginalized communities to hoard his hidden fortune. He calculated that the resulting public outrage would force municipal authorities to investigate my holding companies, dragging my private trust into a prolonged, humiliating public spotlight. He was actively weaponizing the current social climate, knowing that accusations of predatory housing practices would instantly ruin my standing within the city's civic organizations. He promised to make my name utterly radioactive across the entire state. He demanded the $50,000, not just as bail money, but as an absolute extortion fee to purchase his silence. He gave me an ultimatum stating that if the wire transfer was not initiated by the end of the phone call, he would hit send on an email blast that would trigger a massive career-destroying media frenzy. He sneered into the receiver, entirely convinced that a man of my standing would sacrifice any amount of money to avoid a catastrophic public scandal. He believed he had finally discovered my ultimate vulnerability, assuming my pride and my carefully curated public image were my weakest points. Kendall fundamentally misunderstood the foundation of my public standing. I did not inherit a fragile, superficial reputation built on empty corporate networking or expensive gala dinners. During my 4 decades operating within city administration, my legacy was forged through undeniable, verifiable public service. I spent my entire career actively redirecting surplus municipal budgets to construct safe public parks in neglected neighborhoods. I utilized the early profits from my private holding company to anonymously fund local community centers, ensuring underprivileged youth had access to after-school programs and basic resources. My name was permanently etched into the concrete foundations of the city's most successful civic revitalization projects. The community leaders, local organizers, and municipal judges knew exactly who I was and what I had sacrificed for the city. My reputation was absolutely bulletproof, built on decades of transparent, hard-fought advocacy for the exact communities Kendall was now threatening to use as pawns in his extortion scheme. He possessed absolutely zero understanding of the deep, reciprocal loyalty I had cultivated with the city's working-class residents. His hollow threats were entirely impotent against a lifetime of genuine documented philanthropy. He was attempting to burn down a fortress of goodwill using matches made of paper-thin lies. I listened to the sharp, ragged breathing of my son echoing through the speakerphone as he eagerly waited for me to surrender. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany desk, and delivered my final response with absolute, chilling tranquility. I instructed Kendall to call the press immediately. I told him to contact every single journalist, blogger, and news anchor on his contact list. I advised him to send out his fabricated emails and launch his malicious media campaign without a second of hesitation. The line went completely silent, the sheer shock of my response entirely paralyzing his offensive strategy. I spoke with a quiet, unyielding authority, informing my son that a man who wholly owns his truth fears absolutely no journalist. I stated that my decades of verifiable public service and my immaculate civic record would easily withstand the pathetic, fabricated slanders of a desperate, bankrupt fraudster. I reminded him that any competent reporter conducting a rudimentary background check would immediately uncover his freshly minted federal indictments, his loan fraud, and his wife's violent arrest record. The media would not destroy me. They would publicly expose him. Kendall stammered, his voice breaking, as the reality of his absolute powerlessness finally shattered his arrogance. He realized his ultimate weapon was entirely useless. He tried to speak to pivot to another desperate lie, but I did not afford him the opportunity. I reached out and pressed the red button on the console. I severed the connection instantly, cutting off his frantic voice and replacing it with a flat, final dial tone. I sat back in the quiet of my home, fully prepared for whatever pathetic storm he tried to conjure. I locked the study door, knowing I had just severed his final desperate lifeline to the outside world. The automatic sliding doors of the neighborhood supermarket parted, letting out a blast of conditioned air into the crisp morning chill. I stepped onto the concrete pavement, carrying a single brown paper grocery bag holding nothing more than fresh coffee beans and a loaf of sourdough bread. I had barely taken 3 steps toward my parked sedan when a sleek white broadcast van with the vibrant logo of a local sensationalist news channel aggressively jumped the curb, blocking my path completely. The heavy side door slid open before the vehicle even came to a complete halt. A sharply dressed reporter with perfectly styled hair sprinted toward me, closely shadowed by a cameraman hoisting a heavy lens onto his shoulder. The reporter did not offer a professional greeting or a request for a formal interview. He lunged forward, physically blocking my access to my car, and shoved a foam-tipped microphone directly into my face. The red recording light on the camera blinked ominously, indicating a live, unedited feed. The reporter began firing a rapid, aggressive volley of highly accusatory questions. He demanded immediate answers regarding the explosive email blast his network had just received from my son. He asked how I could justify operating as a tyrannical patriarch, ruthlessly hoarding vast reserves of family wealth while systematically destroying the livelihoods of young entrepreneurs. He practically shouted into the microphone, demanding I answer the allegations that I was a malicious slumlord orchestrating hostile corporate takeovers and unjustly evicting innocent families to satisfy my own limitless greed. Kendall had actually executed his pathetic extortion threat, entirely convinced that a sudden ambush by the local media would force me into an immediate humiliated surrender right there in the grocery store parking lot. I did not raise my hands to shield my face from the blinding camera light. I did not duck my head retreat into the safety of the supermarket or offer a panicked, defensive denial. I stood my absolute ground on the cold concrete, my posture perfectly rigid and my expression entirely devoid of fear or intimidation. I slowly lowered my grocery bag onto the hood of my sedan and turned to face the camera lens directly. The reporter paused, his aggressive momentum momentarily faltering against my absolute lack of panic. He expected a terrified, cornered old man desperately trying to hide his face from the city. Instead, he found a man completely prepared for the exact public battle Kendall had so foolishly initiated. I reached down and picked up the heavy, worn leather briefcase I carried with me everywhere since the eviction attempt began. I placed the briefcase flat on the trunk of my car and snapped the brass latches open. The sharp, metallic clicks echoed clearly through the reporter's microphone. I reached inside and withdrew a massive, neatly bound stack of heavily watermarked certified financial documents. I turned back to the reporter, looked straight into the live camera, and stated with a booming, authoritative clarity that since my son wished to litigate our private family finances in the public square, I would gladly oblige him with absolute transparency. I did not offer vague counter-accusations or emotional pleas for public sympathy. I weaponized the undeniable truth. I held up the first document, a certified bank transfer bearing the official seal of the state registry, and began reading the itemized financial records aloud on live television. I kept my voice perfectly measured, devoid of anger, delivering the documented facts with the lethal precision of a seasoned prosecutor. I read the exact dates, the specific account routing numbers, and the massive monetary values of every single deposit I had voluntarily made to sustain Kendall's lavish lifestyle. The reporter fell completely silent, his sensationalist ambush entirely derailed by the sudden, overwhelming presentation of hard evidence. I systematically laid out the paper trail of my son's immense privilege, broadcasting the proof of my lifelong generosity directly to the entire city. The financial records I broadcasted to the morning news audience were not trivial family expenses or minor living stipends. They were the undeniable architecture of Kendall's entirely subsidized existence. I read the exact ledger entries detailing the staggering sum of $400,000 I had personally wired to his accounts over the last decade. I held up the cleared receipts for his private university tuition, a massive expenditure that allowed him to graduate completely free of crippling student debt. I presented the notarized wire transfers that covered the exorbitant down payments on not one but two different luxury residential properties he and Madison claimed they purchased through their own brilliant corporate savvy. I showcased the dealership invoices proving I outright bought the imported sports cars he currently used to project his image of a self-made financial prodigy. Every single receipt I read aloud systematically dismantled the fraudulent narrative of his independent success. I exposed the undeniable reality that his entire adult life, his corporate ventures, and his arrogant public persona were entirely funded by the very father he was now actively trying to destroy in the press. I looked directly down the barrel of the camera lens, my voice cutting through the morning air with absolute chilling finality. I formally and publicly branded Kendall a privileged, ungrateful fraud who had built a hollow empire on the back of his father's relentless labor. I stated clearly to the viewers that a man who attempts to falsely imprison his own mother and maliciously slander the father who funded his entire existence does not possess the moral integrity required to handle the public's finances. I closed my briefcase with a sharp snap, leaving the stunned reporter completely speechless on his own live broadcast, and drove away from the supermarket. The impact of the raw, unedited confrontation was instantaneous and entirely catastrophic for my son. The local news station aired the footage completely uncut, and the dramatic parking lot broadcast went instantly viral across every major social media platform in the state. The citizens of our city, the same working-class people I had spent 4 decades building community centers and public parks for, rallied behind me with overwhelming, savage intensity. The public backlash against Kendall was an absolute tidal wave of righteous fury. By noon, the digital footprint of his corporate startup was flooded with thousands of enraged comments condemning his deceit and his horrific elder abuse. The fatal blow arrived just before the financial markets closed that afternoon. Terrified of the radioactive public relations disaster, 3 major local businesses formally and publicly terminated their lucrative vendor contracts with Kendall's management firm. He had attempted to summon a media storm to destroy my pristine reputation, but he had only succeeded in broadcasting his own undeniable villainy to the entire world, ensuring his complete professional annihilation. The atmosphere inside the glass-walled conference room of Kendall's tech startup was suffocating. Less than 24 hours after the disastrous supermarket broadcast went viral, Kendall scrambled to assemble a mandatory emergency meeting with his primary investors. He stood at the head of the long obsidian table, his usually immaculate, arrogant appearance entirely shattered. His custom-tailored suit hung awkwardly on his frame. His expensive tie was loosened and heavy patches of sweat bled through the fabric beneath his arms. He gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles bone-white, facing a firing squad of furious venture capitalists and angry board members. The room vibrated with outright unapologetic hostility. The lead investor, a ruthless corporate backer named Harrison, slammed his palm against the glass surface, demanding immediate and total transparency. Harrison demanded to know exactly why 3 of their most lucrative client contracts had evaporated before noon. He aggressively questioned the catastrophic public relations nightmare currently trending across every digital platform, explicitly citing the viral video of my parking lot confrontation. The barrage of accusations did not stop at corporate losses. Another board member demanded an explanation for the federal freeze placed upon Kendall's primary operating accounts, pointing out that payroll and essential vendor payments were effectively paralyzed. They ruthlessly pressed him on the humiliating, highly public arrest of his wife, questioning how Madison's severe felony charges for extortion and perjury would impact the firm's strict regulatory compliance. Kendall darted his eyes around the room, resembling a cornered animal, realizing the exit routes were permanently sealed. The men and women staring back at him were not sympathetic family members. They were financial apex predators who smelled blood in the water. They demanded absolute assurance that their millions in startup capital were not evaporating in the flames of his spectacular personal meltdown. Kendall swallowed hard, wiping a thick layer of perspiration from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He squared his shoulders, desperately attempting to project the untouchable, arrogant corporate persona that had originally conned these people into funding him. He raised his hands in a placating gesture and launched into a frantic, meticulously fabricated series of lies. He assured the boardroom that the entire public spectacle was nothing more than a malicious, localized misunderstanding orchestrated by a vindictive, senile relative. He explicitly minimized my live broadcast, claiming the bank documents I exposed were outdated, heavily doctored, and entirely irrelevant to his current operations. Kendall swore to the investors that his aggressive legal team was actively drafting a massive defamation lawsuit to silence me and immediately restore the firm's public image. When pressed about the federal freeze on his assets, he lied with chilling ease. He claimed it was a standard routine administrative hold triggered by a minor clerical error during a recent tax filing, vehemently denying any active criminal fraud investigation. He insisted Madison's arrest was a localized police blunder that would be entirely dismissed and expunged by the end of the week. The board remained entirely unconvinced, their expressions hardened into concrete masks of absolute financial skepticism. Harrison threatened to trigger the emergency liquidation clause embedded in their contracts, a move that would immediately dismantle the startup and seize Kendall's remaining operational hardware to recoup their losses. Kendall's facade of aggressive confidence instantly crumbled into pathetic, naked desperation. He abandoned his corporate posturing and physically leaned across the obsidian table, pleading with his backers. He begged them not to pull their funding, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, frantic whine. He promised the board a miraculous financial resurrection. Kendall guaranteed a massive, unprecedented influx of private capital within exactly 24 hours. He swore he had secured a silent offshore investor willing to bridge the lost contracts and inject enough liquid cash to cover all outstanding margin calls. He swore on his professional reputation that the funds were already clearing international wire protocols. He frantically insisted that liquidating the company now would destroy their greatest return on investment, crying out that he just needed one more night to finalize the transfer. He was spinning fragile plates on a collapsing stage, buying time with phantom money he absolutely did not possess. Kendall fundamentally misunderstood how thoroughly his corporate foundation had already been hollowed out. While he had spent the previous week desperately threatening me from the county jail lobby and orchestrating his pathetic media ambush, Gregory was silently executing a lethal financial counteroffensive. Gregory utilized his vast network of corporate contacts to meticulously map the underlying architecture of Kendall's management firm. He discovered that my son had not built his startup on solid revenue, but on a highly volatile mountain of high-interest mezzanine debt and leveraged commercial loans. Utilizing the immense liquid capital secured within my blind trust, Gregory established a complex web of anonymous proxy LLCs. Working entirely in the shadows, Gregory systematically approached Kendall's primary creditors. The lenders, already incredibly nervous about Kendall's erratic market behavior and the emerging public scandals, eagerly accepted immediate cash buyouts. Within 5 days, Gregory had quietly purchased every single primary debt obligation tied to the startup. Kendall believed he was answering to the venture capitalists sitting in his boardroom, entirely oblivious to the reality that his massive corporate debts had been consolidated and transferred. He did not own his company. He was merely renting the title from the man he was actively trying to destroy. Kendall continued his frantic, humiliating pleas, promising the silent investors that his imaginary offshore capital would solve every single structural failure by tomorrow morning. His desperate monologue was abruptly silenced by the heavy rhythmic thud of the solid oak boardroom doors swinging violently open. Every head in the glass-walled room turned toward the entrance. I walked slowly into the center of the corporate sanctuary, my posture perfectly rigid, my heavy boots sinking into the plush carpet. Gregory flanked me on my right, carrying a thick leather-bound legal binder. Kendall froze completely, the color draining entirely from his face as he stared at me in absolute paralyzing horror. The investors watched in stunned silence as I bypassed the lower seats and marched directly to the head of the obsidian table. Gregory stepped forward and dropped the heavy binder onto the glass surface. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. I looked directly into Kendall's terrified, bloodshot eyes. I did not raise my voice or offer a dramatic, emotional reprimand. I simply announced to the silent room that there would be no miraculous capital injection because the startup no longer belonged to Kendall. I formally informed the board that through a series of highly aggressive proxy acquisitions, I had personally bought out the entirety of the firm's massive leveraged debt. I declared that due to Kendall's extreme documented insolvency and his blatant breach of the fundamental financial covenants, I was immediately calling in the loans. I stated with absolute freezing finality that I was converting the defaulted debt into controlling equity. Kendall gasped for air, his hands clawing at his chest as the reality of his total annihilation set in. I looked down at my son and informed him that I was now the primary shareholder, the absolute owner of his company, and he was officially terminated. The absolute finality of my declaration hung in the cold air of the glass-walled boardroom. Kendall's eyes darted frantically from the heavy leather binder resting on the obsidian table to the unyielding faces of the investors and finally back to me. The fragile illusion of his corporate superiority shattered into a million jagged pieces. He let out a visceral, animalistic roar that tore through the sterile silence of the room. He completely abandoned any remaining shred of professional composure. He kicked his heavy executive chair backward, sending it crashing violently against the floor-to-ceiling window. Kendall lunged across the length of the conference room, his face flushed a dark, furious crimson. He bypassed Gregory, entirely charging directly toward me with his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He shrieked that I had no right to step foot in his building, screaming that he had built this empire from nothing and would not let a pathetic, vindictive old man steal his life's work. He intended to physically grab me by the collar and hurl me out of the corporate sanctuary he mistakenly believed he still owned. He closed the distance in 3 massive strides, his breath hissing through his clenched teeth, completely consumed by the primal, violent panic of a cornered predator facing absolute ruin. I did not flinch or take a single step backward. I remained planted firmly at the head of the table, my hands resting calmly on the leather binder, watching my son reduce himself to a rabid, violent spectacle in front of the very financial backers he had spent years trying to impress. Kendall never reached me. Before his outstretched hands could even graze the fabric of my suit jacket, 2 massive corporate security guards materialized from the hallway. Gregory had meticulously positioned them right outside the heavy oak doors the moment we arrived in the building. The guards moved with brutal, practiced efficiency. They intercepted Kendall mid-lunge, wrapping their thick arms around his shoulders and waist. The sheer momentum of his charge carried them all forward, but the guards anchored their weight and violently slammed Kendall face first against the polished mahogany paneling of the boardroom wall. The heavy thud of the impact silenced his shrieks. One guard pinned Kendall's arms firmly behind his back, securing him immovably against the wood, while the other placed a heavy hand on the back of his neck to keep his face pressed flat. Kendall thrashed wildly against their iron grip, spitting muffled, breathless curses and demanding his employees intervene. No one moved to assist him. Harrison and the rest of the venture capitalists remained seated, watching the pathetic, violent meltdown with expressions of absolute, unadulterated disgust. The arrogant tech visionary had devolved into a common thug, throwing a physical tantrum in his own boardroom. I stepped calmly around the struggle. I pulled out the heavy executive chair at the absolute head of the obsidian table, taking the exact seat Kendall had occupied just minutes prior, and sat down. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket and opened the leather binder. I did not address the thrashing man pinned against the wall. I turned my attention directly to the assembled investors. I commanded the room with the quiet, undeniable authority of majority ownership. I formally convened an immediate emergency shareholder vote. I cited Kendall's extreme documented insolvency, his catastrophic mishandling of public relations, and his volatile physical behavior as grounds for an absolute vote of no confidence. I pushed a stack of freshly drafted corporate resolutions across the glass surface toward Harrison. I instructed the board to review the equity transfer documents, making it abundantly clear that my proxy LLCs now held the supermajority voting rights. The vote was a mere formality, a procedural execution to legally sever Kendall from the corporate entity. When Gregory negotiated the stealth acquisition of the mezzanine debt over the past week, he did not merely purchase the financial obligations. He ruthlessly restructured the underlying covenants. I explicitly instructed him to embed aggressive zero-tolerance morality clauses directly into the new equity conversion agreements. These highly specific legal tripwires granted the majority shareholder the unilateral power to instantly terminate any executive officer involved in active federal fraud investigations or pending felony indictments. We knew the moment Kendall presented the poisoned red folder to his attorney, he triggered a massive federal response. The morality clauses were the lethal fail-safe, ensuring that the second the authorities froze his personal accounts, his corporate shielding dissolved entirely. He had unknowingly signed away his right to severance packages, golden parachutes, or drawn-out arbitration. By attempting to illegally steal my blind trust, Kendall provided the exact federal ammunition required to activate the morality clause and justify his immediate unceremonious removal from the company register without a single penny of compensation. I looked up from the corporate resolutions and locked eyes with Kendall. He had stopped thrashing his chest, heaving heavily against the mahogany wall as he stared back at me. I spoke with a voice devoid of any paternal warmth, projecting the cold mechanical tone of a corporate liquidator. I formally informed Kendall that his employment was terminated effective immediately. I stated that his title as Chief Executive Officer was permanently revoked, his access to the corporate servers was instantly disabled, and his 6-figure salary was completely liquidated to offset the immense damages caused by his federal fraud exposure. I methodically stripped away every remaining layer of his professional dignity in front of the very people he had desperately tried to impress. I nodded to the security guards. They pulled Kendall away from the wall and began marching him roughly toward the open boardroom doors. The sheer finality of his total destruction snapped the last thread of his sanity. As the guards dragged him across the threshold, Kendall twisted his head around his face, a contorted mask of pure, absolute malice. He knew his financial empire was ashes. He knew his legal freedom was rapidly expiring. With his professional life obliterated, he aimed for the only vulnerability I had left. He screamed my name down the hallway, his voice echoing violently off the glass walls. He shrieked that this was not over. He promised that if I took his company, he would drag Brenda directly into the federal wreckage. He vowed to legally petition for emergency medical conservatorship over my wife, threatening to lock her away in a state psychiatric facility, just to ensure I suffered the rest of my days in absolute agony. He was dragged into the elevator, his final desperate threat ringing through the silent corridor. The echo of Kendall's vicious threat reverberated through the empty elevator shaft as I descended to the ground floor. The sheer, calculating malice in his voice overrode any remaining corporate satisfaction. I abandoned my usual measured composure, sprinting across the polished marble lobby and bursting through the glass revolving doors into the harsh afternoon sunlight. I threw myself into the driver's seat of my heavy work truck, the engine roaring to life before my door even slammed shut. I drove with absolute reckless desperation, my knuckles gripping the steering wheel tight enough to drain the blood from my hands. I ignored speed limits and wove violently through the heavy downtown traffic, my mind flooded with horrific scenarios of what a cornered, bankrupt predator might do to my wife. Kendall had lost his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. He had absolutely nothing left to lose, making him exponentially more dangerous. The drive back to my neighborhood felt like a suffocating eternity. I skidded onto my quiet suburban street, the tires squealing against the asphalt, and slammed the brakes in front of my driveway. My worst fears materialized instantly. The heavy oak front door of my home was standing wide open, swinging slightly in the cold wind. I threw the truck into park and scrambled out of the cabin. There, on the manicured grass of our front lawn, the nightmare was actively unfolding. Kendall was physically assaulting his own mother. He had his hands clamped viciously around Brenda's fragile wrist, his face twisted into a mask of pure, frantic desperation. He was forcefully dragging her away from the safety of the porch, entirely ignoring her verbal protests, and pulling her relentlessly toward the open passenger door of his idling sports car. I sprinted across the frost-covered grass, my voice tearing through the quiet neighborhood as I commanded him to release her immediately. Kendall did not stop pulling. He yanked Brenda closer to the vehicle, his breathing ragged and his eyes wide with a terrifying, unhinged mania. He shouted back at me, projecting a deeply fabricated narrative designed entirely for any neighbors who might be watching through their blinds. He shrieked that he was rescuing his mother from a tyrannical, financially abusive husband. He claimed I had completely lost my mind, aggressively hoarding the family wealth and isolating her from her only son. He masked his violent kidnapping attempt as a righteous protective extraction. But beneath the loud performative shouts, I could hear the rapid, cold calculations of a man attempting his final desperate grift. His actual strategy was sickeningly transparent. By physically removing Brenda from the premises and isolating her under his roof, he intended to immediately petition the courts for an emergency medical conservatorship. He planned to falsely declare her mentally unfit to care for herself, utilizing the exact same fraudulent psychiatric tactics he had originally intended for me. If a corrupt judge granted him temporary guardianship over Brenda, he would instantly gain unchecked legal access to her half of our joint marital assets and her substantial, lifelong spousal benefits. He was actively trying to kidnap his mother to use her as a human shield against his own massive financial insolvency. Brenda dug her heels into the soft earth, refusing to yield to his violent momentum. She did not scream for help or dissolve into the fragile panic Kendall expected. She braced her weight, pulling her arm back with a surprising, visceral strength that momentarily halted his progress. She locked her gaze onto his face, her expression devoid of any maternal warmth. Kendall barked at her to get into the vehicle, tightening his painful grip on her forearm. He desperately promised her that he would protect her, whispering frantic lies about how I was going to leave them both with absolutely nothing. He was begging his victim to willingly step into her own cage. Kendall vastly underestimated the quiet, enduring resilience of the woman who raised him. Throughout the entire ordeal of his financial treachery, the eviction attempt and Madison's violent ambush, Brenda had maintained a stoic, unbroken silence. Kendall mistook her profound grief for paralyzing weakness, entirely failing to realize that her quiet demeanor was masking fierce, calculated preparation. She had not been passively waiting for the destruction of our family. Early that very morning, while I was preparing the corporate takeover documents, Brenda had quietly driven downtown to meet with Gregory at the municipal courthouse. She sat across from a federal judge and provided sworn, devastating testimony regarding Kendall's aggressive extortion tactics and his wife's violent theatrics. Utilizing the undeniable surveillance footage Gregory had compiled, she successfully petitioned for a comprehensive, immediate protective order. She had methodically secured her own legal fortress, ensuring that her son possessed absolutely zero rights to access her property, her finances, or her physical person. Kendall gave one final violent tug, attempting to break her leverage and throw her into the leather passenger seat. Brenda did not stumble. She utilized the forward momentum, twisting her body sharply and bringing her free hand across the space between them with absolute stunning force. The sharp, cracking sound of her palm striking Kendall's jaw echoed like a gunshot across the quiet lawn. The sheer impact snapped his head to the side and completely broke his physical grip. Kendall staggered backward, clutching his reddened cheek in absolute shock. He looked at the woman he viewed only as a pawn, his arrogant mind entirely failing to process the physical rebellion. Brenda did not retreat a single inch. She reached into the deep pocket of her wool cardigan and pulled out a thick, folded legal document stamped with the heavy blue seal of the county court. She stepped forward, closing the distance he had just created, and shoved the court-ordered restraining order violently against his chest. She looked directly into his terrified eyes, her voice completely devoid of a mother's compassion. She stated with a cold, absolute finality that he was permanently dead to her. The sharp rising wail of approaching police sirens suddenly pierced the freezing afternoon air, growing rapidly louder as multiple cruisers turned onto our street. Gregory had notified the authorities the exact second Kendall threatened Brenda in the boardroom. Kendall stared at the legal document in his trembling hand, the blue ink sealing his total excommunication from the family. He looked from Brenda's unyielding face to the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the neighborhood windows. The absolute reality of his complete isolation finally shattered his arrogance. He dropped the paper, threw himself into the driver's seat of his sports car, and slammed the accelerator, fleeing the scene like the pathetic, broken coward he had chosen to become. The heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, sealing the sterile, cavernous room in an oppressive silence. The ambient hum of the air conditioning did nothing to cool the suffocating tension radiating from the defense table. I sat completely still in the plaintiff's gallery, my posture rigid, with Gregory seated to my immediate right. Directly across the aisle, Kendall and Madison sat at the long wooden defense table, positioning their chairs as far apart as the physical dimensions of the furniture would allow. They did not exchange a single glance. The arrogant, unified front they had so proudly paraded through the city for the past 3 years had entirely evaporated. The presiding federal judge, a stern man with decades of zero-tolerance jurisprudence etched into his features, rustled his paperwork at the elevated bench. He formally announced the commencement of the combined hearings, consolidating the staggering array of civil and criminal charges into one unified legal reckoning. The docket read like a catastrophic autopsy of Kendall's corporate empire and Madison's personal malice. The judge listed the severe allegations with a flat mechanical cadence, detailing the aggressive real estate fraud, the leveraged corporate extortion, the aggravated perjury stemming from the fabricated assault charges against me, and the final catastrophic eviction dispute. Kendall stared blankly at the polished wood in front of him, the residual swelling from Brenda's powerful slap still visibly purpling along his jawline. The frantic manic energy that had fueled his violent kidnapping attempt just weeks prior had been completely replaced by a hollow, paralyzing dread. Madison sat rigid, her perfectly tailored designer suit unable to mask the violent trembling of her hands. The invisible walls of the federal court had closed in, trapping them both under the blinding, inescapable fluorescent lights of federal scrutiny. The legal proceedings rapidly degenerated from a structured federal hearing into a vicious, unrestrained bloodbath. Kendall's defense attorney stood first, recognizing immediately that shielding his client from the overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence was mathematically impossible. He abandoned any pretense of joint marital defense and launched a direct lethal strike against Madison. He boldly claimed that his client was merely a naive, overworked tech visionary who had been completely manipulated by a pathologically greedy spouse. The attorney dramatically gestured toward Madison, accusing her of single-handedly orchestrating the aggressive real estate fraud to illegally finance her wildly unsustainable luxury event planning agency. He painted Kendall as a passive victim of her endless materialistic demands, arguing that Madison had coerced him into leveraging his startup to maintain her artificial high society image. Madison did not wait for her own attorney to object. She shattered the courtroom decorum, leaping to her feet and shrieking across the defense table. She called her husband a pathetic, bankrupt coward who was desperately trying to use her as a human shield. Her defense attorney quickly scrambled to intercede, instantly launching a ferocious counteroffensive. Madison's counsel presented the judge with the falsified loan documents, loudly declaring that Kendall had deliberately forged Madison's signature on the mezzanine debt contracts without her consent or knowledge. The lawyer branded Kendall a predatory corporate grifter who had weaponized his own marriage to fraudulently secure offshore capital. The formal legal arguments instantly dissolved into a chaotic screaming match between husband and wife. Kendall slammed his fists on the table, calling Madison a manipulative parasite who drained his accounts dry and ruined his relationship with his parents. Madison screamed back, entirely uncensored, calling him a spineless fraud who never possessed a fraction of the business acumen he projected. They tore each other apart in front of the federal judge, trading venomous, deeply personal insults that the court stenographer diligently recorded onto the permanent public record. Every shred of their manufactured loyalty was immolated in their desperate scrambling attempts to save their own individual skins. They were two drowning predators violently pushing each other underwater just to steal a single breath of air. The judge hammered his wooden gavel against the sounding block, his voice booming over the microphone as he demanded immediate order and threatened both defendants with instantaneous contempt of court charges. I sat in the gallery and watched the spectacular implosion with absolute undisturbed tranquility. Gregory and I had spent the preceding weeks meticulously constructing an impenetrable fortress of financial documentation. We had relentlessly cataloged every fraudulent wire transfer, verified every forged signature through independent handwriting experts, and secured federal banking affidavits confirming the exact timeline of Kendall's corporate insolvency. I did not need to raise my voice, hurl emotional accusations, or participate in the chaotic, humiliating public spectacle unfolding across the aisle. Gregory simply stood when the judge addressed our side, silently passing a thick indexed binder of unassailable forensic evidence to the bailiff. Our strategy was entirely reliant on the cold, undeniable gravity of the documented truth, stripping away any need for theatrical courtroom debates. I leaned back against the hard wooden bench, my hands resting calmly on my knees. I allowed the sheer weight of their own documented malice to crush them. By remaining entirely silent and simply letting the paperwork dictate the narrative, I forced Kendall and Madison to turn their desperate, panicked energy exclusively upon each other. We built the arena, locked the doors, and simply watched the defendants gleefully execute their own mutual destruction. The federal judge struck his gavel one final time, the sharp crack instantly extinguishing the toxic, lingering murmurs between the defense attorneys. He leaned forward over the elevated wooden bench, his expression radiating absolute, unforgiving authority. He stated for the official record that he had reviewed the extensive forensic binders provided by my legal counsel. He did not mince words or offer any degree of judicial leniency. The judge spoke with a chilling, mechanical precision, declaring that he had rarely encountered a case of such blatant, malicious financial extortion and calculated elder abuse. He ruled immediately and entirely in my favor across every single consolidated charge. The judge formally finalized the eviction, permanently stripping Madison of her commercial lease and ordering the immediate seizure of her business assets. He validated my complete corporate takeover of Kendall's startup, legally cementing my ownership of his entire professional portfolio. But the final lethal blow was purely financial. The judge ordered Kendall and Madison to pay massive joint punitive restitution directly to my private trust for the damages caused by their coordinated fraud and perjury. He read the exact figure aloud, an astronomical multi-million-dollar penalty that echoed through the courtroom like a death sentence. It was a staggering sum that entirely eclipsed their remaining liquidated assets. Kendall collapsed forward, his forehead hitting the wooden table as all the air left his lungs. Madison covered her mouth, a sharp, ragged sob tearing through her throat. They were officially bound to a debt they could absolutely never repay. Their total, irreversible financial ruin was no longer a private family dispute. It was permanently etched into federal law. I stood up, adjusted my suit jacket, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving them completely buried beneath the inescapable rubble of their own greed. I parked my weathered, rust-flecked work truck beneath the sprawling canopy of an ancient oak tree directly across the wide, manicured street from the sprawling luxury estate Kendall and Madison had leased. The engine clicked softly as it cooled in the crisp morning air. I rolled the heavy manual window down, resting my forearm against the chilled metal of the door. The neighborhood was usually an impenetrable fortress of suburban silence, a curated sanctuary for the city's wealthy elite. Today, it was the staging ground for a legally sanctioned dismantling. The immediate crushing consequences of the federal judge's punitive restitution order were materializing with absolute mechanical efficiency. A synchronized fleet of heavy-duty commercial flatbed tow trucks and unmarked white transit vans breached the perimeter of the pristine cul-de-sac. Their flashing amber caution lights cast an erratic, frantic glow against the immaculate white columns of Kendall's rented mansion. They did not park with any regard for the manicured landscaping. The heavy diesel engines roared as the drivers aggressively backed their massive rigs straight up the paved circular driveway, entirely blocking any avenue of escape. A team of federal bailiffs, distinguished by the stark yellow lettering stamped across their dark tactical jackets, stepped out of the lead vehicles. They moved with absolute, uncompromising authority, carrying thick stacks of court-ordered seizure warrants securely fastened to heavy metal clipboards. They did not knock or politely ring the doorbell. They marched straight up the sweeping brick steps and began pounding heavily against the custom double doors, their fists striking the polished wood with the undeniable force of a federal mandate. The protective bubble of arrogance and stolen wealth that Kendall had so carefully constructed around himself was about to burst violently in front of his entire affluent neighborhood. The front doors were violently thrown open from the inside. Kendall stood in the threshold, still wearing the wrinkled, sweat-stained dress shirt from his catastrophic court appearance the day prior. A federal bailiff instantly shoved the heavy seizure warrant directly against his chest, stepping past him into the grand foyer without waiting for an invitation. A highly coordinated team of professional movers swarmed into the residence behind the marshals. They operated like a relentless swarm of locusts, systematically stripping the property of every single asset that held liquidated value. I watched from the cab of my truck as the heavy flatbeds winched Kendall's imported European sports car and Madison's massive luxury SUV onto their steel decks, securing the wheels with heavy chains. The loud, metallic ratcheting echoed sharply down the quiet street, a permanent end to their vehicular status symbols. The movers began carrying out the physical manifestations of their fabricated wealth. They hauled out pristine white leather sofas, massive flat-screen televisions, and meticulously crated pieces of expensive contemporary artwork. Everything they had purchased using stolen funds and leveraged debt was methodically loaded into the waiting transit vans to satisfy the astronomical, court-ordered restitution payable to my private trust. Kendall stood paralyzed on his pristine front lawn, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides as his entire material existence was dismantled piece by piece. Madison stormed out of the front door moments later, completely ignoring the federal agents passing her in the foyer. She dragged a single oversized designer suitcase down the brick steps, her face twisted in a mask of absolute unrestrained fury. She marched directly toward Kendall, stopping inches from his face. She did not lower her voice or care about the neighbors watching from their windows. She screamed that he was a pathetic, incompetent failure who had ruined her life and destroyed her reputation. Kendall reached out desperately, trying to grab her wrist to plead with her, begging her to stay and figure it out. Madison violently slapped his hand away. With a swift, disgusted motion, she yanked her heavy diamond wedding ring off her finger and hurled it directly into the thick, frost-covered grass at his feet. She turned on her heel and marched rapidly down the street toward the main avenue, abandoning her bankrupt husband to the federal scavengers without a single backward glance. The repo men continued their work, entirely stripping the luxury estate bare until there was absolutely nothing left. I sat in the quiet cab of my truck, watching the broken, isolated man kneeling in the wet grass, frantically running his hands through the dirt to search for a discarded ring. The sight triggered a profound, visceral memory that cut through the cold reality of the morning. I clearly remembered standing on the small patch of lawn in front of our first modest home, holding the handlebars of a bright red bicycle. Kendall was 5 years old, his face entirely illuminated by pure, uncorrupted joy. I had worked double shifts for 2 months straight at the municipal planning office just to afford that bicycle for his birthday. When I finally let go of the seat and he pedaled forward on his own, his triumphant laughter had been the greatest reward of my life. I had built my entire world around protecting that innocent, happy child. The devastating contrast between the boy on the bicycle and the shattered, deceitful man crawling on the ground before me was absolute. The son I had sacrificed everything to raise was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow shell of greed who had willingly chosen malice over love. Kendall slowly rose from the grass, his expensive slacks stained with dark mud. He brushed the dirt from his hands and lifted his head, his gaze sweeping frantically across the street. His eyes suddenly locked directly onto the familiar rust-flecked grille of my heavy work truck parked under the oak tree. He froze. The color completely drained from his face as he recognized my silhouette sitting silently behind the steering wheel. For a fraction of a second, the deep-seated, arrogant conditioning of his entire life kicked in. He genuinely believed that the sheer magnitude of his suffering would force me to relent. He began to run toward the street, his dress shoes slapping heavily against the pavement. His eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate hope, silently expecting his father to step out of the vehicle, open his wallet, and miraculously halt the federal seizure. He actually believed I had arrived to offer a last-minute forgiving bailout, assuming my paternal instincts would instantly override the devastation he had caused. He crossed the center line of the asphalt, raising his hand to wave me down, his mouth opening to shout my name. I did not roll down the window. I did not unlock the doors or offer a single gesture of comfort. I locked eyes with my son for one final absolute moment through the cold glass of the windshield. I stared at him with complete, unyielding finality, letting the total absence of my forgiveness register entirely in his mind. I reached down, firmly gripped the gear shifter, and pulled it into drive. I pressed my foot heavily against the accelerator. The engine roared, and I pulled smoothly away from the curb, driving steadily down the avenue, leaving Kendall standing completely alone in the middle of the empty street as his empire was permanently erased. The storm rolled in just past midnight, transforming the quiet suburban street into a torrential downpour. Heavy sheets of rain pounded relentlessly against the cedar shingles of my roof, the rhythmic drumming masking the usual nocturnal silence of the neighborhood. I sat alone in the dimly lit study, the glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The federal documents and financial ledgers from the morning's repossession were finally filed away, but the quiet offered no immediate comfort. A sudden heavy thud echoed through the hallway, momentarily cutting through the noise of the storm. I paused, listening intently. A second knock followed, slower this time, sounding hollow and deeply desperate against the thick oak of the front door. I pushed myself up from the leather chair and walked slowly down the corridor, the hardwood floor cold beneath my feet. I did not bother checking the security cameras. I already knew exactly who was standing on the other side of the threshold. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door inward, letting a gust of freezing, rain-soaked air sweep into the warm foyer. Kendall stood shivering under the porch light. The expensive, custom-tailored suit he had worn to his federal court hearing was completely ruined, plastered to his skin, and dripping dark water onto the welcome mat. His perfectly styled hair was matted flat against his forehead. He clutched a single torn canvas duffel bag to his chest, his knuckles white with the strain. He looked entirely hollowed out, stripped of the corporate arrogance and manufactured superiority that had defined his existence for the past decade. The man who had confidently attempted to steal my entire estate just weeks prior was now standing in the freezing rain, resembling a frightened, displaced ghost. Kendall did not attempt to force his way inside. He stood shivering on the wet concrete, his shoulders slumped and his chest heaving with ragged, uneven breaths. Stripped of his money, abandoned by his wife, and permanently exiled from his corporate empire, the reality of his absolute destitution had finally crushed him. His legs simply gave out. He dropped heavily to his knees right there on the porch, the impact splashing rainwater across my leather slippers. He released his torn duffel bag and reached out his trembling hands, grasping desperately at the hem of my trousers. He began to weep loud, wretched sobs that violently shook his entire frame. He begged me for a place to sleep, pleading for just one night out of the freezing storm. He swore he had absolutely nowhere else to go, claiming his former associates had blocked his calls and the local hotels had instantly flagged his frozen credit cards. When his tears failed to secure an immediate invitation inside, he instantly pivoted to emotional manipulation. He weaponized his own childhood, pulling up memories from decades ago in a frantic attempt to reignite my paternal guilt. He choked out stories of the camping trips we took when he was 10 years old, sobbing about how I used to carry him on my shoulders when he grew too tired to walk the trails. He begged for forgiveness, crying out that he was still my son, my only boy, and that family was supposed to endure every hardship together. He deliberately used the exact tone of voice he had mastered as a child whenever he needed me to fix a broken toy or bandage a scraped knee. He was banking entirely on the assumption that a father's unconditional love would ultimately override any degree of betrayal. He looked up at me from the cold concrete, his face streaked with rain and tears, demanding absolution and shelter. He cried out that a father could not simply leave his own flesh and blood to die in the street. He desperately tried to lay the heavy burden of his survival squarely back onto my shoulders, expecting me to open the door and absorb the catastrophic consequences of his own malicious choices. I looked down at the weeping man kneeling on my porch, feeling the immense crushing weight of fatherhood press heavily against my chest. A vivid memory surfaced in my mind, sharp and painfully clear. I remembered standing by his hospital crib the night he was born, staring at his tiny, fragile hands. I had made a silent, solemn vow that night to protect him from the harshness of the world, promising myself that I would sacrifice every ounce of my own comfort to ensure he never knew pain or hunger. For 35 years I had honored that vow to a fault. I had shielded him from every consequence, subsidized every failure, and paved his road with my own relentless labor. But looking at the wreckage of his character now, I realized that my endless protection had become his ultimate poison. By constantly shielding him from the world, I had successfully raised a predator who believed he was entirely immune to reality. I understood then with absolute and heartbreaking clarity that I could no longer protect him from the world. The only way to save my son now was to protect him from himself. I did not step aside. I did not extend my hand to pull him up from the wet concrete, nor did I offer a single word of comforting absolution. I maintained my position squarely in the doorway, letting the freezing wind whip through the foyer. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and retrieved a thick, waterproof plastic envelope I had prepared earlier that afternoon. I stepped forward, the toes of my shoes stopping inches from his kneeling form, and held the packet out to him. Kendall stared at it, his sobbing abruptly halting as confusion registered in his bloodshot eyes. He slowly reached up with a trembling hand and took the envelope. I spoke with a voice that was perfectly calm, devoid of anger, but completely stripped of paternal leniency. I informed him that inside the envelope he would find a printed list of every operational municipal homeless shelter in the county, alongside a prepaid monthly bus pass and exactly $100 in small bills. Kendall stared at this plastic packet in horror, his mouth opening in a silent protest as the absolute finality of my decision truly settled into his bones. He realized I was not going to rescue him. I looked directly down into his eyes and delivered my final truth. I told him that my money and my protection had only taught him how to be a parasite. I stated clearly that survival was the only teacher he had left. I stepped backward into the warmth of the foyer. I did not wait for his response or listen to his renewed frantic pleas. I firmly grasped the brass handle of the heavy oak door and pulled it shut, the heavy deadbolt sliding into place with a definitive metallic click, leaving him entirely alone in the dark pouring rain. The morning dawned with a piercing, crystalline clarity that felt entirely alien after the suffocating darkness of the previous night. The torrential rain had completely washed the neighborhood clean, leaving behind a profound and absolute silence. I stood at the center of the grand foyer, listening intently to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. The house was finally undeniably quiet. There were no frantic phone calls ringing through the hallways, no sudden violent pounding against the heavy oak doors, and no lingering specters of extortion waiting on the front lawn. The external enemy had been entirely eradicated. I walked slowly through the ground floor of the home I had spent 4 decades building. I trailed my hand along the smooth mahogany wainscoting of the corridor, feeling the solid, unyielding strength of the wood beneath my fingertips. I stepped into the formal dining room, tracing the edge of the large dining table where my son had once sat as a child, back when our family was whole and uncorrupted. Every room I passed through felt remarkably lighter, as if a thick toxic fog had been permanently vented from the atmosphere. I walked into the study and ran my palms over the leather binding of the financial ledgers sitting neatly on the desk. This fortress had been violently besieged, its defenses tested by the very person it was designed to protect. But the walls had held. I had stood my ground against a relentless tide of manipulation and greed, defending the sanctity of this sanctuary with every ounce of my strength. The sheer tranquility of the morning was not merely an absence of noise. It was the physical manifestation of a hard-won victory. The house belonged entirely to Brenda and me, again scrubbed clean of the malicious presence that had tried to steal it. As I moved through the silent rooms, the final inevitable conflict arose within my own mind. The battle against Kendall's corporate theft and physical intimidation was definitively over, but the emotional reckoning was just beginning. I stood before the bay window overlooking the driveway, forcing myself to accept the brutal, uncompromising reality of the situation. I had not just defeated a hostile corporate adversary, I had permanently and irreversibly severed the bond with my only child. In order to save my marriage, protect my legacy, and reclaim my own dignity, I had to execute the total destruction of my son. There would be no future reconciliations, no tearful apologies, and no prodigal returns. The boy I had raised was dead, entirely consumed by the fraudulent, greedy monster he had chosen to become. A heavy, profound grief settled deeply into my chest, a mourning not for the man who had knelt on my porch the night before, but for the innocent child he had once been. I accepted this immense grief as the necessary cost of my family's salvation. I walked over to the security console mounted on the study wall and activated the exterior camera feeds. The high-definition monitors flickered to life, displaying every angle of the property in crisp morning light. The front porch was empty. The street was completely devoid of unfamiliar vehicles. The perimeter was absolutely secure. The chaotic, suffocating noise of Kendall's existence, the endless demands, the fabricated emergencies, the vicious threats had been entirely excised from our reality. For years, I had allowed his manufactured crises to dictate the rhythm of my life, mistakenly believing that a father's duty required me to absorb his toxic fallout. Now, looking at the peaceful, empty lawns on the monitors, I realized the absolute necessity of the boundary I had drawn. The silence was not a void. It was a barricade. I had successfully insulated my home against his destructive orbit. The internal war between a father's unconditional love and a man's instinct to protect his wife had ended in a decisive, permanent victory for the latter. I turned away from the security screens, leaving the monitors glowing with the undeniable proof of our safety. The painful emotional surgery was complete, and the lingering infection of Kendall's influence had been entirely removed. I stepped into the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed coffee grounding me in the present moment. I looked down at my weathered hands, tracing the deep lines and calluses that mapped 40 years of relentless, unyielding labor. I had spent my entire adult life accumulating assets, building a corporate portfolio, and securing commercial properties under the false assumption that financial leverage equated to familial security. I had believed that providing an impenetrable economic safety net would automatically generate a foundation of love and respect. Kendall had violently shattered that illusion, proving that immense capital only accelerates the corruption of an ungrateful mind. Pouring the dark, steaming coffee into 2 ceramic mugs, the true measure of my life's work became blindingly clear. My actual wealth was not calculated in offshore proxy accounts, majority shareholder equity, or the vast sums locked within my private trust. The only legacy that mattered was the profound, unbroken peace I shared with the woman sleeping upstairs. Brenda and I had weathered poverty, sacrificed our own comfort, and ultimately survived the catastrophic betrayal of our own flesh and blood. That enduring partnership was the only fortress worth defending. I carried the 2 warm ceramic mugs through the rear sliding doors and stepped out onto the back porch. Brenda was already there, sitting quietly in her woven wicker chair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket against the morning chill. She looked out over the meticulously landscaped garden, her posture completely relaxed, entirely free from the suffocating anxiety that had plagued her for months. I handed her a mug, and she offered a soft, genuine smile that communicated 1,000 words of shared relief. We sat together in a comfortable, companionable silence, listening to the morning birds singing in the oak trees. The familiar rhythmic rumble of the neighborhood mail truck broke the quiet. The postal worker pulled up to the curb, dropping a thick, heavy manila envelope into our brass mailbox with a loud clatter before driving away. I excused myself, walking down the paved garden path to retrieve the delivery. I pulled the heavy packet from the box. The return address bore the stark, official seal of the United States District Court. It was the finalized federal indictment outlining the impending criminal trial and severe felony charges pending against Kendall and Madison. I held the comprehensive documentation of my son's legal demise in my hand, feeling the substantial weight of the paper. I did not break the seal. I did not possess a single ounce of curiosity regarding the exact mechanisms of his federal prosecution. I walked directly into the garage, marched over to the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder, and fed the unopened envelope straight into the steel blades. The machine roared to life instantly, reducing the federal indictment into thousands of meaningless, illegible strips of paper. The past was completely and absolutely dead. I turned my back on the shredder, returned to the peaceful sanctuary of the back porch, and poured Brenda a fresh cup of coffee. The estate was entirely impenetrable. The toxic elements were permanently eradicated, and absolute order was restored. The silent adjustment was finally complete. True love requires the absolute courage to enforce strict boundaries against those who weaponize affection for selfish gain. People frequently confuse unconditional love with infinite tolerance, mistakenly believing that biological family ties obligate them to endure endless emotional manipulation. Realizing that a deeply toxic relationship cannot be salvaged through constant financial sacrifice is a painful but deeply necessary awakening. Authentic wealth is never defined by accumulated assets, luxury estates, or massive corporate portfolios. Instead, it is measured solely by the unyielding peace found in genuine partnerships. Protecting your dignity demands the heartbreaking choice to abandon toxicity and save yourself completely. Please share your own experiences with setting difficult family boundaries in the comments section below. If this story resonated with you, ensure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications for more powerful life lessons.